An American Tragedy, Part 2, continuing on cassette number 3, Side 1. I went to 3 Mile Bay on much the same errand, to see Captain Mooney of the Cygnus, and the 3 men and Mason, together with the sheriff and his deputies, went in a high-powered launch chartered for the occasion, to follow the now-known course of the only recently departed camping party, first to Little Fish Inlet, and from there, in case the trail proved sound, to Bear Lake. And on Monday morning, while those at Ramshorn Point, after breaking camp, were already moving on toward Shelter Beach, 14 miles east, Mason, together with Slack and his 3 deputies, arrived at the camp deserted the morning before. And there the sheriff and Mason, taking counsel with each other, and then dividing their forces so that in canoes commandeered from lone residents of the region, they now proceeded, Mason and First Deputy Kraut along the south shore, Slack and Second Deputy Sissel along the north shore, while young Swink, blazing with a desire to arrest and handcuff someone, yet posing for the occasion as a lone young hunter or woodsman, paddled directly east along the center of the lake in search of any informing smoke or fires or tents or individuals idling along the shores. And with great dreams of being the one to capture the murderer, "I arrest you, Clyde Griffiths, in the name of the law," yet because of instructions from Mason as well as Slack, grieving that instead, should he detect any signs, being the furthermost outpost, he must, in order to avoid frightening the prey or losing him, turn on his track and from some point not so likely to be heard by the criminal, fire one single shot from his 8-chambered repeater, whereupon whichever party chanced to be nearest would fire one shot in reply, and then proceed as swiftly as possible in his direction. But under no circumstances was he to attempt to take the criminal alone, unless noting the departure by boat or on foot of a suspicious person who answered the description of Clyde. At this very hour Clyde, with Harley Baggett, Bertine, and Sandra in one of the canoes, paddling eastward along the remainder of the flotilla, looking back and wondering, supposing by now some officer or someone had arrived at Sharon and was following him up here, or would it be hard to find where he'd gone, supposing only that they knew his name? But they did not know his name. Had not the items in the papers proved that? Why worry so always, especially on this utterly wonderful trip, and when at last he and Sandra could be together again? And besides, was it not now possible for him to wander off by himself into these thinly populated woods along the shore to the eastward, toward that inn at the other end of the lake, and not return? Had he not inquired most casually on Saturday afternoon of Harley Baggett as well as others as to whether there was a road south or east from the east end of the lake? And had he not learned there was? And at last at noon, Monday, reaching Shelter Beach, the 3rd spot of beauty contemplated by the planners of this outing, where he helped to pitch the tents again while the girls played about. Yet at the same hour, at the Ramshorn site, because of the ashes from their fires left upon the shore, young Swank, most eagerly and enthusiastically, like some seeking animal, approaching and examining the same and then going on, swiftly. And but 1 hour later Mason and Kraut, reconnoitering the same spot, but without either devoting more than a cursory glance, since it was obvious that the prey had moved farther on. But then greater speed in paddling on the part of Swank, until by 4 he arrived at Shelter Beach, and then descrying as many as a half-dozen people in the water in the distance, at once turning and retreating in the direction of the others in order to give the necessary signal, and some 2 miles back firing one shot, which in his turn was responded to by Mason as well as Sheriff Slack. Both parties had heard, and were now paddling swiftly east. At once Clyde, in the water near Sandra, hearing this, was made to wonder the ominous quality of that first shot, followed by those 2 additional signals farther away, yet seemingly in answer to the first. And then the ominous silence thereafter. What was that? And with Harley Baggett jesting, "Listen to the guy shooting game out of season, will you? It's against the law, isn't it?" "Hey, you!" Grant Cranston shouted. "Those are my ducks down there. Let 'em alone." "If they can't shoot any better than you, Granty, they will let 'em alone." This from Bertine. Clyde, while attempting to smile, looked in the direction of the sound and listened like a hunted animal. What was it now that urged him to get out of the water and dress and run? Hurry, hurry, to your tent, to the woods, quick!" Until at last heeding this, and while most of the others were not looking, hurrying to his tent, changing to the one plain blue business suit and cap that he still possessed, then slipping into the woods back of the camp, out of sight and hearing of all present, until he should be able to think and determine, but keeping always safely inland, out of the direct view of the water, for fear. Who could tell exactly what those shots meant? Yet Sandra, and her words of Saturday and yesterday and today, could he leave her in this way without being sure? Could he? Her kisses, her dear assurances as to the future. What would she think now, and those others, in case he did not go back? The comment which was certain to be made in the Sharon and other papers in regard to this disappearance of his, and which was certain to identify him with the same Clifford Golden or Carl Graham, was it not? Then reflecting also the possible groundlessness of these fears, based on nothing more, maybe, than the chance shots of passing hunters on the lake or in these woods, and then pausing and debating with himself whether to go on or not. Yet, oh, the comfort of these tall pillared trees, the softness and silence of these brown carpeting needles on the ground, the clumps and thickets of underbrush under which one could lie and hide until night should fall again, and then on and on, but turning none the less with the intention of returning to the camp to see whether anyone had come there. He might say he'd taken a walk and got lost in the woods, but about this time, behind a protecting group of trees at least 2 miles west of the camp, a meeting and conference between Mason, Slack, and all the others. And later, as a result of this, and even as Clyde lingered and returned somewhat nearer the camp, Mason, Swank, paddling the canoe, arriving and inquiring of those who were now on shore if a Mr. Clyde Griffiths was present, and might he see him, and Harley Baggett being nearest, replying, "Why, yes, sure, he's around here somewhere," and Stuart Finchley calling, "Hey-o, Griffiths," but no reply. Yet Clyde not near enough to hear any of this, even now returning toward the camp very slowly and cautiously, and Mason concluding that possibly he was about somewhere and unaware of anything, of course, deciding to wait a few minutes anyhow, while advising Swank to fall back into the woods, and if by any chance encountering Slack or any other, to advise him that one man be sent east along the bank and another west, while he, Swank, proceeded in a boat eastward as before to the inn at the extreme end, in order that from there word might be given to all as to the presence of the suspect in this region. In the meanwhile, Clyde, by now only 3/4 of a mile east, and still whispered to by something which said, "Run, run, do not linger," yet lingering and thinking, Sandra, this wonderful life, should he go so? And saying to himself that he might be making a greater mistake by going than by staying, for supposing those shots were nothing, hunters, mere game shots, meaning nothing in his case, and yet costing him all, and yet turning at last and saying to himself that perhaps it might be best not to return at present, anyhow at least not until very late, after dark, to see if those strange shots had meant anything, but then again pausing silently and dubiously, the while vesper sparrows and woodfinches sang, and peering and peeking nervously, and then all at once, not more than 50 feet distant, out of the long tall aisles of the trees before him, a whiskered, woodsman-like type of man, approaching swiftly yet silently, a tall, bony, sharp-eyed man in a brown felt hat and a brownish-gray baggy and faded suit that hung loosely over his spare body, and as suddenly calling as he came, which caused Clyde's blood to run cold with fear and rivet him to the spot, "Hold on a minute, mister. Don't move. Your name don't happen to be Clyde Griffiths, does it?" And Clyde, noting the sharp, inquisitorial look in the eye of the stranger, as well as the fact that he had already drawn a revolver and was lifting it up, now pausing, the definiteness and authority of the man chilling him to the marrow. Was he really being captured? Had the officers of the law truly come for him? God! No hope of flight now. Why had he not gone on? Oh, why not? And at once he was weak and shaking, yet not wishing to incriminate himself, about to reply, "No," yet because of a more sensible thought replying, "Why, yes, that's my name." You're with this camping party just west of here, aren't you?" "Yes, sir, I am." "All right, Mr. Griffiths. Excuse the revolver. I'm told to get you whatever happens, that's all. My name is Kraut, Nicholas Kraut. I'm a deputy sheriff of Cataraqui County, and I have a warrant here for your arrest. I suppose you know what for, and that you're prepared to come with me peaceably." And at this Mr. Kraut gripped the heavy, dangerous-looking weapon more firmly even, and gazed at Clyde in a firm, conclusive way. Why, no, I don't," replied Clyde, weakly and heavily, his face white and thin. "But if you have a warrant for my arrest, I'll go with you, certainly. But what, I don't understand." His voice began to tremble slightly as he said this. Is why you want to arrest me?" "You don't, eh? You weren't up at either Big Bittern or Grass Lake by any chance on last Wednesday or Thursday, eh?" "Why, no, sir, I wasn't," replied Clyde falsely. "And you don't happen to know anything about the drowning of a girl up there that you were supposed to be with? Roberta Alden of Biltz, New York, I believe?" "Why, my God, no," replied Clyde, nervously and staccatically, the true name of Roberta and her dress being used by this total stranger, and so soon, staggering him. Then they knew. They had obtained a clue. His true name and hers. God! "Am I supposed to have committed a murder?" he added, his voice faint, a mere whisper. "Then you don't know that she was drowned last Thursday, and you weren't with her at that time?" Mr. Kraut fixed a hard, inquisitive, unbelieving eye on him. "Why, no, of course I wasn't," replied Clyde, recalling now but one thing, that he must deny all, until he should think or know what else to do or say. "And you didn't meet three men walking south last Thursday night from Big Bittern to 3 Mile Bay at about 11 o'clock? "Why, no, sir. Of course I didn't. I wasn't up there, I told you." "Very well, Mr. Griffiths. I haven't anything more to say. All I'm supposed to do is to arrest you, Clyde Griffiths, for the murder of Roberta Alden. You're my prisoner." He drew forth, more by way of a demonstration of force and authority than anything else, a pair of steel handcuffs, which caused Clyde to shrink and tremble as though he'd been beaten. "You needn't put those on me, mister," he pleaded. "I wish you wouldn't. I never had anything like that on before. I'll go with you without them." He looked longingly and sadly about at the trees, into the sheltering depths of which so recently he ought to have plunged, to safety. "Very well, then," replied the redoubtable Kraut. "So long as you come along peaceful." And he took Clyde by one of his almost palsied arms. "Do you mind if I ask you something else?" asked Clyde, weakly and fearsomely, as they now proceeded, the thought of Sandra and the others shimmering blindingly and reducingly before his eyes. Sandra! To go back there and arrest a murderer, and before her and Bertine. Oh, no. Are you intending to take me to that camp back there?" "Yes, sir. That's where I'm intending to take you now. Them's my orders. That's where the district attorney and the sheriff of Cataraqui County are just now." "Oh, I know, pleaded Clyde hysterically, for by now he'd lost almost all poise. "But couldn't you, so long as I go along just as you want? Those are all my friends, you know, back there, and I'd hate. Couldn't you just take me around the camp somewhere, to wherever you want to take me? I have a very special reason. That is, oh, God, I hope you won't take me back there right now. Will you please, Mr. Kraut?" He seemed to Kraut very boyish and weak now, clean of feature, rather innocent as to eye, well-dressed and well-mannered, not at all the savage and brutal or murderous type he had expected to find. Indeed, quite up to the class whom he, Kraut, was inclined to respect. And might he not, after all, be a youth of very powerful connections? The conversations he'd listened to thus far had indicated that this youth was certainly identified with one of the best families in Lycurgus, and in consequence he was now moved to a slight show of courtesy, and so added, "Very well, young man, I don't want to be too hard on you. After all, I'm not the sheriff or the district attorney, just the arresting officer. There are others down there who are going to be able to say what to do about you, and when we get down to where they are, you can ask them, and it may be that they won't find it necessary to take you back in there. But how about your clothes? They're back there, ain't they?" "Oh, yes, but that doesn't matter," replied Clyde, nervously and eagerly. "I can get those any time. I just don't want to go back now if I can help it." "All right, then, come along," replied Mr. Clout. And so it was that they walked on together now in silence, the tall shafts of the trees in the approaching dusk, making solemn aisles through which they proceeded as might worshippers along the nave of a cathedral, the eyes of Clyde contemplating nervously and wearily a smear of livid red still visible through the trees to the west. Charged with murder, Roberta dead, and Sandra dead to him, and the Griffiths, and his uncle, and his mother, and all those people in that camp. Oh, God! Why was it that he had not run when that something, whatever it was, had so urged him? Chapter 9. In the absence of Clyde, the impressions taken by Mr. Mason of the world in which he moved here, complementing and confirming those of Lycurgus and Sharon, were sufficient to sober him in regard to the ease, possibly, with which previously he'd imagined it might be possible to convict him. For about him was such a scene as suggested all the means as well as the impulse to quiet such a scandal as this. Wealth, luxury, important names and connections to protect, no doubt. Was it not possible that the rich and powerful Griffiths, their nephew seized in this way, and whatever his crime, would take steps to secure the best legal talent available in order to protect their name? Unquestionably, and then with such adjournments as it was possible for such talent to secure, might it not be possible that long before he could hope to convict him, he himself would automatically be disposed of as a prosecutor, and without being nominated for and elected to the judgeship he so craved and needed? Sitting before the circle of attractive tents that faced the lake, and putting in order a fishing pole and reel, was Harley Baggett, in a brightly colored sweater and flannel trousers, and through the open flies of several tents, glimpses of individuals, Sandra, Bertine, Wynette, and others, busy about toilets necessitated by the recent swim. Being dubious because of the smartness of the company as to whether it was politically or socially wise to proclaim openly the import of his errand, he chose to remain silent for a time, reflecting on the difference between the experiences of his early youth and that of Roberta Alden and these others. Naturally, as he saw it, a man of this Griffith's connections would seek to use a girl of Roberta's connections thus meanly and brutally, and hope to get away with it. Yet, eager to make as much progress as he could against whatever inimical fates might now beset him, he finally approached Baggett, and most acidly, yet with as much show of genial and appreciative sociability as he could muster, observed, "A delightful place for a camp, eh? Yeah, we think so. Just a group from the estates and hotels about Sharon, I suppose. Yeah, the south and west shore, principally. Not any of the Griffiths, other than Mr. Clyde, I presume? No, they're still over at Greenwood, I think. You know Mr. Clyde Griffiths personally, I suppose? Oh, sure, he's one of the party. You don't happen to know how long he's been up here this time, I presume? Up with the Cranstons, I mean. Since Friday, I think. I saw him Friday morning, anyhow. But he'll be back here soon, and you can ask him yourself," concluded Baggett, beginning to sense that Mr. Mason was a little too inquisitive, and, in addition, not of either his or Clyde's world. And just then Frank Harriott, with a tennis racket under his arm, striding across the foreground. "Where to, Frankie?" "To try those courts Harrison laid out up here this morning." "Who with?" "Violet, Nadine, and Stewart." "Any room for another court?" "Sure, there's two. Why not get Bert and Clyde and Sandra and come up?" "Well, maybe after I get this thing set." And Mason at once thinking, Clyde and Sandra, Clyde Griffiths and Sandra Finchley, the very girl whose notes and cards were in one of his pockets now. And might he not see her here along with Clyde? Possibly later talk to her about him? But just then Sandra and Bertine and Wynette coming out of their respective tents, and Bertine calling, "Oh, say, Harley, seen Nadine anywhere?" "No, but Frank just went by. He said he was going up to the courts to play with her and Violet and Stu." "Yes? Well, then come on, Sandra. You too, Wynette. We'll see how it looks." Bertine, as she pronounced Sandra's name, turned to take her arm, which gave Mason the exact information and opportunity he desired. that of seeing and studying for a moment the girl who had so tragically, and no doubt all unwittingly, replaced Roberta in Clyde's affections. As he could see for himself, more beautiful, more richly apparelled than ever the other could have hoped to be, and alive, as opposed to the other now dead and in a morgue in Bridgeburg. But even as he gazed, the three tripping off together, arm in arm, Sandra calling back to Harley, "If you see Clyde, tell him to come on up, will you?" And he replying, "Do you think that shadow of yours needs to be told?" Mason, impressed by the color in the drama, looked intently and even excitedly about. Now it was all so plain why he wanted to get rid of the girl, the true underlying motive, that beautiful girl there, as well as this luxury to which he aspired. And to think that a young man of his years and opportunities would stoop to such a horrible trick as that. Unbelievable. And only 4 days after the murder of the other poor girl, playing about with this beautiful girl in this fashion, and hoping to marry her, as Roberta had hoped to marry him. The unbelievable villainies of life. Now, half determining, since Clyde did not appear, that he would proclaim himself and proceed to search for and seize his belongings here, Ed went reappearing, and with a motion of the head indicating that Mason was to follow him, and once well within the shadow of the surrounding trees, indicating no less an individual than Nicholas Kraut, attended by a slim, neatly dressed youth of about Clyde's reported years, who, on the instant, and because of the waxy paleness of his face, he assumed must be Clyde. And at once he now approached him, as might an angry wasp or hornet, only pausing first to ask of Swank where he had been captured and by whom, then gazing at Clyde critically and austerely, as befitted one who represented the power and majesty of the law. "So you're Clyde Griffiths, are you?" "Yes, sir." "Well, Mr. Griffiths, my name is Orville Mason. I'm the district attorney of the county in which Big Bittern and Grass Lake are situated. I suppose you are familiar enough with those two places by now, aren't you?" He paused to see the effect of this sardonic bit of commentary. Yet, although he expected to see him wince and quail, Clyde merely gazed at him, his nervous dark eyes showing enormous strain. "No, sir, I can't say that I am." For with each step through the woods thus far back, there had been growing within him the utter and unshakable conviction that in the face of whatever seeming proof or charges might now appear, he dared not tell anything in regard to himself, his connection with Roberta, his visit to Big Bittern or Grass Lake. He dared not, for that would be the same as a confession of guilt in connection with something of which he was not really guilty. And no one must believe, never, Sandra or the Griffiths or any of these fine friends of his, that he could ever have been guilty of such a thought even. And yet here they were, all within call, and at any moment might approach and so learn the meaning of his arrest. And while he felt the necessity for so denying any knowledge in connection with all this, at the same time he stood in absolute terror of this man, the opposition and irritated mood such an attitude might arouse in him, that broken nose, his large stern eyes, and then Mason, eyeing him as one might an unheard of and yet desperate animal, and irritated also by his denial, yet assuming from his blanched expression that he might and no doubt would shortly be compelled to confess his guilt, continuing with, "You know what you're charged with, Mr. Griffiths, of course?" "Yes, sir. I just heard it from this man here." "And you admit it?" "Why, no, sir. Of course I don't admit it," replied Clyde, his thin and now white lips drawn tight over his even teeth, his eyes full of a deep, tremulous, yet evasive terror. "Why, what nonsense! What effrontery! You deny being up to Grass Lake and Big Bittern on last Wednesday and Thursday?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then," and now Mason stiffened himself in an angry and at the same time inquisitorial way, "I suppose you're going to deny knowing Roberta Alden, the girl you took to Grass Lake and then out on Big Bittern in that boat last Thursday, the girl you knew in Lycurgus all last year, who lived at Mrs. Gilpin's and worked under you in your department at Griffiths and Company, the girl to whom you gave that toilet set last Christmas. I suppose you're going to say that your name isn't Clyde Griffiths, and that you haven't been living with Mrs. Peyton in Taylor Street, and that these aren't letters and cards from your trunk there, from Roberta Alden and from Miss Finchley, all these cards and notes. and extracting the letters and cards as he spoke and waving them before Clyde. And at each point in this harangue, thrusting his broad face, with its flat broken nose and somewhat aggressive chin, directly before Clyde's, and blazing at him with sultry, contemptuous eyes, while the latter leaned away from him, wincing almost perceptibly and with icy chills running up and down his spine and affecting his heart and brain. Those letters, all this information concerning him, and back in his bag in the tent there, all those most recent letters of Sandra's, in which she dwelt on how they were to elope together this coming fall. If only he had destroyed them. And now this man might find those, would, and question Sandra maybe and all these others. He shrunk and congealed spiritually, the revealing effects of his so poorly conceived and executed scheme weighing upon him as the world upon the shoulders of an inadequate Atlas, and yet feeling that he must say something and yet not admit anything, and finally replying, "My name's Clyde Griffiths, all right, but the rest of this isn't true. I don't know anything about the rest of it. Oh, come now, Mr. Griffiths, don't begin by trying to play fast and loose with me. We won't get anywhere that way. You won't help yourself one bit by that with me, and besides, I haven't any time for that now. Remember that these men here are witnesses to what you say. I've just come from Lycurgus, your room at Mrs. Peyton's, and I have in my possession your trunk and this Miss Alden's letters to you. Indisputable proof that you did know this girl, that you courted and seduced her last winter, and that since then, this spring, when she became pregnant on your account, you induced her first to go home and then later to go away with you on this trip in order, as you told her, to marry her. Well, you married her, all right, to the grave. That's how you married her, to the water at the bottom of Big Bittern Lake. And you could actually stand here before me now, when I tell you that I have all the evidence I need right on my person, and say that you don't even know her? Well, I'll be damned!" And as he spoke, his voice grew so loud that Clyde feared that it could be clearly heard in the camp beyond, and that Sandra herself might hear it and come over. And although at the outrush and jab and slash of such dooming facts as Mason so rapidly outlined, his throat tightened, and his hands were with difficulty restrained from closing and clenching vice-wise, at the conclusion of it all he merely replied, "Yes, sir." "Well, I'll be damned," reiterated Mason. "I can well believe now that you would kill a girl and sneak away in just such a way as you did, and with her in that condition. But then to try to deny her own letters to you, why, you might as well try to deny that you're here and alive. These cards and notes here, what about them? I suppose they're not from Miss Finchley? How about those? Do you mean to tell me these are not from her either?" He waved them before Clyde's eyes, and Clyde, seeing that the truth concerning these, Sandra being within call, was capable of being substantiated here and now, replied, "No, I don't deny that those are from her." "Very good. But these others from your trunk in the same room are not from Miss Alden to you?" "I don't care to say as to that," he replied, blinking feebly as Mason waved Roberta's letters before him. "Of all things," ticked Mason in high dudgeon. "Such nonsense! Such effrontery! Oh, very well, we won't worry about all that now. I can easily prove it all when the time comes. But how you can stand there and deny it, knowing that I have the evidence, is beyond me. A card in your own handwriting, which you forgot to take out of the bag you had her leave at Gun Lodge while you took yours with you. Mr. Carl Graham, Mr. Clifford Golden, Mr. Clyde Griffiths. A card on which you wrote from Clyde to Bert, 'Merry Christmas.' Do you remember that? Well, here it is." And here he reached into his pocket and drew forth the small card taken from the toilet set and waved it under Clyde's nose. "Have you forgotten that, too? Your own handwriting?" And then, pausing and getting no reply, finally adding, "Why, what a dunce you are! What a poor plotter, without even the brains not to use your own initials in getting up those fake names you'd hoped to masquerade under. Mr. Carl Graham, Mr. Clifford Golden." At the same time fully realizing the importance of a confession, and wondering how it was to be brought about here and now, Mason suddenly, Clyde's expression, his frozen-faced terror, suggesting the thought that perhaps he was too frightened to talk, at once changed his tactics, at least to the extent of lowering his voice, smoothing the formidable wrinkles from his forehead and about his mouth. "You see, it's this way, Griffiths," he now began, much more calmly and simply. "Lying, or just foolish, thoughtless denial under such circumstances as these, can't help you in the least. It can only harm you, and that's the truth. You may think I've been a little rough so far, but it's only because I've been under a great strain myself in connection with this case, trying to catch up with someone I thought would be a very different type from yourself. But now that I see you and see how you feel about it all, how really frightened you are by what has happened, it just occurs to me that there may be something in connection with this case, some extenuating circumstances, which, if they were related by you now, might throw a slightly different light on all this. Of course, I don't know. You yourself ought to be the best judge, for I am laying the thought before you for what it's worth. For, of course, here are these letters. Besides, when we get to 3 Mile Bay tomorrow, as we will, I hope there will be those 3 men who met you the other night, walking south from Big Bittern. And not only those, but the innkeeper from Grass Lake, the innkeeper from Big Bittern, the boat-keeper up there who rented that boat, and the driver who drove you and Roberta Alden over from Gun Lodge. They will identify you. Do you think they won't know you? Not any of them? Not be able to say whether you are up there with her or not, or that a jury, when the time comes, won't believe them?" And all this Clyde registered mentally like a machine clicking to a coin, yet said nothing, merely staring frozen. "And not only that," went on Mason, very softly and most ingratiatingly, "but there's Mrs. Peyton. She saw me take these letters and cards out of that trunk of yours in your room and from the top drawer of your chiffonier. Next, there are all those girls at that factory where you and Miss Alden worked. Do you suppose they're not going to remember all about you and her when they learn that she's dead? Oh, what nonsense! You ought to be able to see that for yourself, whatever you think. You certainly can't expect to get away with that. It makes a sort of a fool out of you. You can see that for yourself." He paused again, hoping for a confession. But Clyde, still convinced that any admission in connection with Roberta or Big Bittern spelled ruin, merely stared while Mason proceeded to add, "All right, Griffiths, I'm now going to tell you one more thing, and I couldn't give you better advice if you were my own son or brother, and I were trying to get you out of this instead of merely trying to get you to tell the truth. If you hope to do anything at all for yourself now, it's not going to help you to deny everything in the way you're doing. You are simply making trouble and condemning yourself in other people's eyes. Why not say that you did know her, and that you were up there with her, and that she wrote you those letters, and be done with it? You can't get out of that, whatever else you may hope to get out of. Any sane person, your own mother if she were here, would tell you the same thing. It's too ridiculous and indicates guilt rather than innocence. Why not come clean here and now as to those facts anyhow, before it's too late to take advantage of any mitigating circumstances in connection with all this, if there are any? And if you do now, and I can help you in any way, I promise you here now that I'll be only too glad to do so. For after all, I'm not out here just to hound a man to death, or make him confess to something that he hasn't done, but merely to get at the truth in the case. But if you're going to deny that you even knew this girl when I tell you I've all the evidence and can prove it, why then—" And here the district attorney lifted his hands aloft most wearily and disgustedly. But now, as before, Clyde remained silent and pale, in spite of all Mason had revealed, and all that this seemingly friendly, intimate advice seemed to imply. Still, he could not concede that it would be anything less than disastrous for him to admit that he even knew Roberta. The fatality of such a confession in the eyes of these others here, the conclusion of all his dreams in connection with Sandra and this life. And so, in the face of this, silence still. And at this Mason, irritated beyond measure, finally exclaiming, "Oh, very well, then. So you've finally decided not to talk, have you?" And Clyde, blue and weak, replied, "I had nothing to do with her death. That's all I can say now." And yet even as he said it, thinking that perhaps he'd better not say that perhaps he'd better say, Well, what? That he knew Roberta, of course, had been up there with her, for that matter, but that he had never intended to kill her, that her drowning was an accident, for he'd not struck her at all, except by accident, had he? Only it was best not to confess to having struck her at all, wasn't it? For who, under such circumstances, would believe that he'd struck her with a camera by accident? Best not to mention the camera, since there was no mention anywhere in the papers that he had one with him. And he was still cogitating while Mason was exclaiming, "Then you admit that you knew her?" "No, sir." "Very well, then," he now added, turning to the others. "I suppose there's nothing for it but to take him back there and see what they know about him. Perhaps I will get something out of this fine bird, to confront him with his friends. His bag and things are still back there in one of those tents, I believe. Suppose we take him down there, gentlemen, and see what these other people know about him." And now swiftly and coldly he turned, while Clyde, already shrinking at the horror of what was coming, exclaimed, "Oh, please, no! You don't mean to do that, do you? Oh, you won't do that? Oh, please, no!" And at this point, Trout speaking up and saying, "He asked me back there in the woods if I wouldn't ask you not to take him there." "Oh, so that's the way the wind blows, is it?" exclaimed Mason at this. "Too thin-skinned to be shown up before ladies and gentlemen of the 12th Lake Colony, but not even willing to admit that you knew the poor little working girl who worked for you. Very good. Well, then, my fine friend, suppose you come through with what you really do know now, or down there you go." And he paused a moment to see what effect that would have. "We'll call all those people together and explain just how things are, and then see if you will be willing to stand there and deny everything." But noting still a touch of hesitation in Clyde, he now added, "Bring him along, boys." And turning toward the camp, he proceeded to walk in that direction a few paces, while Kraut, taking one arm, and Swank another, and beginning to move Clyde, he ended by exclaiming, "Oh, please, no. Oh, I hope you won't do anything like that, will you, Mr. Mason? Oh, I don't want to go back there, if you don't mind. It isn't that I'm guilty, but you can get all my things without my going back there. And besides, it will mean so much to me just now." Beads of perspiration once more burst forth on his pale face and hands, and he was deadly cold. "Don't want to go, eh?" exclaimed Mason, pausing as he heard this. "It would hurt your pride, would it, to have 'em know? Well, then, supposing you just answer some of the things I want to know, and come clean and quick, or off we go, and that without one more moment's delay. Now, will you answer, or won't you?" And again he turned to confront Clyde, who, with lips trembling and eyes confused and wavering, nervously and emphatically announced, "Of course I knew her. Of course I did. Sure. Those letters show that. But what of it? I didn't kill her, and I didn't go up there with her with any intention of killing her either. I didn't, I tell you. It was all an accident. I didn't even want to take her up there. She wanted me to go away with her somewhere because, well, you know, her letters show. And I was only trying to get her to go off somewhere by herself, so she would let me alone, because I didn't want to marry her, that's all. And I took her out there not to kill her at all, but to try to persuade her, that's all. And I didn't upset the boat, at least I didn't mean to. The wind blew my hat off, and she and I, got up at the same time to reach for it, and the boat upset, that's all. And the side of it hit her on the head. I saw it, only I was too frightened, the way she was struggling about in the water, to go near her, because I was afraid that if I did she might drag me down. And then she went down, and I swam ashore. And that's the God's truth." His face as he talked had suddenly become all flushed, and his hands also. Yet his eyes were tortured, terrified pools of misery. He was thinking, but maybe there wasn't any wind that afternoon, and maybe they would find that out. Or the tripod hidden under a log. If they found that, wouldn't they think he hit her with that? He was wet and trembling. But already Mason was beginning to question him again. "Now let's see as to this a minute. You say you didn't take her up there with any intention of killing her?" "No, sir, I didn't." "Well, then, how was it that you decided to write your name 2 different ways on those registers up there at Big Bittern and Grass Lake?" "Because I didn't want anyone to know that I was up there with her." Oh, I see. Didn't want any scandal in connection with the condition she was in. No, sir. Yes, sir, that is. But you didn't mind if her name was scandalized in case she was found afterwards? But I didn't know she was going to be drowned, replied Clyde, slyly and shrewdly, sensing the trap in time. But you did know that you yourself weren't coming back, of course. You knew that, didn't you? Why, no, sir. I didn't know that I wasn't coming back. I thought I was. Pretty clever, thought Mason to himself, but not saying so, and then rapidly, and so in order to make everything easy and natural as possible for you to come back, you took your own bag with you and left hers up there. Is that the way? How about that? But I didn't take it because I was going away. We decided to put our lunch in it. We or you? We. And so you had to carry that big bag in order to take a little lunch along, eh? Couldn't you have taken it in a paper or in her bag? Well, her bag was full, and I didn't like to carry anything in a paper. Oh, I see. Too proud and sensitive, eh? But not too proud to carry a heavy bag all the way, say 12 miles in the night to 3 Mile Bay, and not ashamed to be seen doing it either, were you? Well, after she was drowned, and I didn't want to be known as having been up there with her and had to go along. He paused while Mason merely looked at him, thinking of the many, many questions he wanted to ask him, so many, many more, and which, as he knew or guessed, would be impossible for him to explain. Yet it was getting late, and back in the camp were Clyde's as yet unclaimed belongings, his bag and possibly that suit he'd worn that day at Big Bittern, a grey one as he'd heard, not this one, and to catechize him here this way in the dusk, while it might be productive of much if only he could continue it long enough, still there was the trip back, and en route he would have ample time to continue his questionings. And so, although he disliked much so to do at the moment, he now concluded with, "Oh, well, I tell you, Griffiths, we'll let you rest here for the present. It may be that what you're saying is so. I don't know. I most certainly hope it is for your sake. At any rate, you go along there with Mr. Kraut. He'll show you where to go." And then, turning to Swank and Cloud, he exclaimed, "All right, boys, I'll tell you how we'll do. It's getting late, and we'll have to hurry a little if we expect to get anywhere yet tonight. Mr. Kraut, suppose you take this young man down where those other 2 boats are and wait there. Just halloo a little as you go along to notify the sheriff and Cecil that we're ready, and then Swank and I'll be along in the other boat as soon as we can." And so saying, and Kraut obeying, he and Swank proceeded inward through the gathering dusk to the camp, while Kraut with Clyde went west, hallooing for the sheriff and his deputy until a response was had. Chapter 10. The effect of Mason's reappearance in the camp with the news, announced first to Frank Harriot, next to Harley Bagot and Grant Cranston, that Clyde was under arrest, that he actually had confessed to having been with Roberta at Big Bittern, if not to having killed her, and that he, Mason, was there with Swank to take possession of his property, was sufficient to destroy this pretty outing as by a breath. For although amazement and disbelief and astounded confusion were characteristic of the words of all, nevertheless here was Mason demanding to know where were Clyde's things, and asserting that it was at Clyde's request only that he was not brought here to identify his own possessions. Frank Harriot, the most practical of the group, sensing the truth and authority of this, at once led the way to Clyde's tent, where Mason began an examination of the contents of the bag and clothes, while Grant Cranston, as well as Bagot, aware of Saunders' intense interest in Clyde, departed first to call Stewart, then Bertine, and finally Sondra, moving apart from the rest the more secretly to inform her as to what was then occurring. And she, following the first clear understanding as to this, turning white and fainting at the news, falling back in Grant's arms and being carried to her tent, where after being restored to consciousness she exclaimed, "I don't believe a word of it. It's not true. Why, it couldn't be. That poor boy. Oh, Clyde, where is he? Where have they taken him?" But Stewart and Grant, by no means as emotionally moved as herself, cautioning her to be silent. It might be true at that. Supposing it were, the others would hear, wouldn't they? And supposing it weren't, He could soon prove his innocence and be released, couldn't he? There was no use in carrying on like this now. But then soundering her thoughts, going over the bare possibility of such a thing. A girl killed by Clyde at Big Bittern, himself arrested and being taken off in this way, and she thus publicly, or at least by this group, known to be so interested in him. Her parents to know, the public itself to know, maybe. But Clyde must be innocent. It must be all a mistake. And then her mind, turning back and thinking of that news of the drowned girl she'd first heard over the telephone there at the Harriet's, and then Clyde's whiteness, his illness, his all but complete collapse. Oh, no, not that. Yet his delay in coming from Lycurgus until the Friday before, his failure to write from there, and then the full horror of the charge returning, as suddenly collapsing again, lying perfectly still and white while Grant and the others agreed among themselves that the best thing to be done was to break up the camp, either now or early in the morning, and depart for Sharon. And Sandra returning to consciousness after a time, tearfully announcing that she must get out of here at once, that she couldn't endure this place, and begging Bertine and all the others to stay close to her and say nothing about her having fainted and cried, since it would only create talk, and thinking all the time of how, if this were all true, she could secure those letters she'd written to him. Oh, heavens! For supposing now at this time they should fall into the hands of the police or the newspapers and be published, and yet moved by her love for him, and for the first time in her young life shaken to the point where the grim and stern realities of life were thrust upon her gay and vain notice. And so it was immediately arranged that she leave with Stewart, Bertine, and Grant for the Matistic Inn at the eastern end of the lake, since from there at dawn, according to Baggett, they might leave for Albany, and so in a roundabout way for Sharon. In the meantime, Mason, after obtaining possession of all Clyde's belongings here, quickly making his way west to Little Fish Inlet and 3 Mile Bay, stopping only for the first night at a farmhouse, and arriving at 3 Mile Bay late on Tuesday night, yet not without en route catechizing Clyde as he'd planned, the more particularly since in going through his effects in the tent at the camp, he'd not found the grey suit said to have been worn by Clyde at Big Bittern. And Clyde, troubled by this new development, denying that he'd worn a grey suit, and insisting that the suit he had on was the one he'd worn. But wasn't it thoroughly soaked? Yes. Well then, where was it cleaned and pressed afterward? In Sharon? In Sharon? Yes, sir. By a tailor there? Yes, sir. What tailor? Alas, Clyde could not remember. Then you wore it crumpled and wet, did you, from Big Bittern to Sharon? Yes, sir. And no one noticed it, of course? Not that I remember, no. Not that you remember, eh? Well, we'll see about that later. And deciding that unquestionably Clyde was a plotter and a murderer. Also that eventually he could make Clyde show where he'd hidden the suit or had had it cleaned. Next there was the straw hat found on the lake. What about that? By admitting that the wind had blown his hat off, Clyde had intimated that he'd worn a hat on the lake, but not necessarily the straw hat found on the water. But now Mason was intent on establishing within hearing of these witnesses the ownership of the hat found on the water, as well as the existence of a second hat worn later. That straw hat of yours that you say the wind blew in the water, you didn't try to get that either at the time, did you? No, sir. Didn't think of it, I suppose, in the excitement? No, sir. But just the same, you had another straw hat when you went down through the woods there. Where did you get that one? And Clyde, trapped and puzzled by this, pausing for the fraction of a second, frightened and wondering whether or not it could be proved that this second straw hat he was wearing was the one he'd worn through the woods, also whether the one in the water had been purchased in Utica as it had, and then deciding to lie. But I didn't have another straw hat. Without paying any attention to that, Mason reached over and took the straw hat on Clyde's head and proceeded to examine the lining with its imprint. Stark and Company, Lycurgus. End of cassette number 3, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 3, side 2 of An American Tragedy, Part 2. Mr. Mason said, This one has a lining, I see. Bought this in Lycurgus, eh? Yes, sir. When? Oh, back in June. But still you're sure now it's not the one you wore down through the woods that night? No, sir. Well, where is it, then? And Clyde once more pausing like one in a trap and thinking, my God, how am I to explain this now? Why did I admit that the one on the lake was mine? Yet, as instantly recalling that whether he had denied it or not, there were those at Grass Lake and Big Bittern who would remember that he'd worn a straw hat on the lake, of course. Where was it, then? Insisted Mason. And Clyde at last saying, oh, I was up here once before and wore it then. I forgot it when I went down the last time, but I found it again the other day. Oh, I see. Very convenient, I must say. He was beginning to believe that he had a very slippery person to deal with indeed, that he must think of his traps more shrewdly, and at the same time determining to summon the Cranstons and every member of the Bear Lake party in order to discover whether any recalled Clyde not wearing a straw hat on his arrival this time, also whether he'd left a straw hat the time before. He was lying, of course, and he would catch him. And so no real peace for Clyde at any time between there and Bridgeburg and the county jail. Or however much he might refuse to answer, still Mason was forever jumping at him with such questions as, why was it if all you wanted to do was to eat lunch on shore, that you had to row all the way down to that extreme south end of the lake, when it isn't nearly so attractive there as it is at other points? And where was it that you spent the rest of that afternoon? Surely not just there. And then jumping back to Saunders' letters discovered in his bag. How long had he known her? Was he as much in love with her as she appeared to be with him? Wasn't it because of her promise to marry him in the fall that he decided to kill Miss Alden? But while Clyde vehemently troubled to deny this last charge, still for the most part he gazed silently and miserably before him with his tortured and miserable eyes. And then a most wretched night spent in the garret of a farmhouse at the west end of the lake, and on a pallet on the floor, while Sissel, Swank, and Kraut, gun in hand, in turn kept watch over him, and Mason and the sheriff and the others slept below stairs, and some natives, because of information distributed somehow, coming toward morning to inquire, "We hear the fellow that killed the girl over to Big Britain is here. Is that right?" And then waiting to see them off at dawn in the ford secured by Mason. And again at Little Fish Inlet, as well as 3 Mile Bay, actual crowds, farmers, storekeepers, summer residents, woodsmen, children, all gathered because of word telephoned on ahead, apparently. And at the latter place, Burley, Height, and Newcomb, who, because of previously telephoned information, had brought before one Gabriel Gregg, a most lanky and crusty and meticulous justice of the peace, all of the individuals from Big Bittern necessary to identify him fully. And now Mason, before this local justice, charging Clyde with the death of Roberta, and having him properly and legally held as a material witness to be lodged in the county jail at Bridgeburg, and then taking him, along with Burton, the sheriff, and his deputies, to Bridgeburg, where he was promptly locked up. And once there, Clyde throwing himself on the iron cot, and holding his head in a kind of agony of despair. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and just outside the jail as they approached, he'd seen a crowd of at least 500, noisy, jeering, threatening, for had not the news been forwarded that because of his desire to marry a rich girl, he had most brutally assaulted and murdered a young and charming working girl, whose only fault had been that she loved him too well. There had been hard and threatening cries of, "There he is, the dirty bastard! You'll swing for this yet, you young devil! Wait and see!" This from a young woodsman not unlike Swank in type, a hard, destroying look in his fierce young eyes, leaning out from the crowd, and worse, a waspish type of small-town slum girl, dressed in a gingham dress, who in the dim light of the arcs had leaned forward to cry, "Look at the dirty little sneak, the murderer! You thought you'd get away with it, didn't you?" And Clyde, crowding closer to Sheriff Slack and thinking, "Why, they actually think I did kill her, and they may even lynch me." But so weary and confused and debased and miserable that at the sight of the outer steel jail door swinging open to receive him, he actually gave vent to a sigh of relief because of the protection it afforded. But once in his cell, suffering none the less without cessation the long night through from thoughts concerning all that had just gone, Sandra, the Griffiths, Bertine, all those people in Lycurgus, when they should hear in the morning. His mother eventually, everybody. Where was Sandra now? For Mason had told her, of course, and all those others, when he'd gone back to secure his things, and they knew him now for what he was, a plotter of murder. Only, if somebody could only know how it had all come about, if Sandra, his mother, anyone could truly see. Perhaps if he were to explain all this to this man Mason now, before it all went any further, exactly how it had all happened. But that meant a true explanation as to his plot, his real original intent, that camera, his swimming away, that unintended blow. And who was going to believe him as to that? His hiding the tripod afterwards? Besides, once all that was known, would he not be done for just the same in connection with Sandra, the Griffiths, everybody? And very likely prosecuted and executed for murder just the same. Oh, heavens, murder! And to be tried for that now. This terrible crime against her proved. They would electrocute him just the same, wouldn't they? And then the full horror of that coming upon him. Death, possibly, and for murder. He sat there quite still. Death! God! If only he'd not left those letters written in by Roberta and his mother in his room there at Mrs. Peyton's. If only he had removed his trunk to another room, say, before he left. Why hadn't he thought of that? Yet, as instantly thinking, might not that have been a mistake, too, being seemingly a suspicious thing to have done then? But how came they to know where he was from and what his name was? Then, as instantly returning in mind to the letters in the trunk, for as he now recalled, in one of those letters from his mother, she'd mentioned that affair in Kansas City, and Mason would come to know of that. If only he had destroyed them, Roberta's, his mother's, all. Why hadn't he? But not being able to answer why, just an insane desire to keep things, maybe, anything that related to him, a kindness, a tenderness toward him. If only he'd not worn that second straw hat, had not met those 3 men in the woods. God! He might have known they would be able to trace him in some way. If only he'd gone on in that wood at Bear Lake, taking his suitcase and Sandra's letters with him. Perhaps, who knows, in Boston or New York, or somewhere he might have hidden away. Unstrung and agonized, he was unable to sleep at all, but walked back and forth, or sat on the side of the hard and strange cot, thinking. And at dawn a bony, aged, roomy jailer, in a baggy, worn blue uniform, bearing a black iron tray, on which was a tinful of coffee, some bread, and a piece of ham with 1 egg, and looking curiously and yet somehow indifferently at Clyde, while he forced it through an aperture, only wide and high enough for its admission, though Clyde wanted nothing at all. And then later Crowd and Cecil and Swank, and eventually the sheriff himself, each coming separately to look in and say, "Well, Griffiths, how are you this morning?" or, "Hello, anything we can do for you?" while their eyes showed the astonishment, disgust, suspicion, or horror with which his assumed crime had filled them. Yet in the face of that, having one type of interest, and even sycophantic pride in his presence here. For was he not a Griffiths, a member of the well-known social group of the big central cities to the south of here? Also the same to them, as well as to the enormously fascinated public outside, as a trapped and captured animal, taken in their legal net by their own superlative skill, and now held as a witness to it. And with the newspapers and the people certain to talk, enormous publicity for them, their pictures in the paper as well as his, their names persistently linked with his. And Clyde, looking at them between the bars, attempted to be civil, since he was now in their hands, and they could do with him as they would. Chapter 11. In connection with the autopsy and its results, there was a decided setback, for while the joint report of the 5 doctors showed an injury to the mouth and nose, the tip of the nose appears to have been slightly flattened, the lips swollen, one front tooth slightly loosened, and an abrasion of the mucous membrane within the lips. All agreed that these injuries were by no means fatal. The chief injury was to the skull, the very thing which Clyde in his first confession had maintained, which appeared to have been severely bruised by a blow of some sharp instrument, unfortunately in this instance, because of the heaviness of the blow of the boat, signs of fracture and internal hemorrhage which might have produced death. But the lungs, when placed in water, sinking, an absolute proof that Roberta could not have been dead when thrown into the water, but alive and drowning, as Clyde had maintained, and no other signs of violence or struggle, although her arms and fingers appeared to be set in such a way as to indicate that she might have been reaching or seeking to grasp something. The whale of the boat? Could that be? Might Clyde's story, after all, conceal a trace of truth? Certainly these circumstances seemed to favor him a little, yet as Mason and the others agreed, all these circumstances most distinctly seemed to prove that although he might not have slain her outright before throwing her into the water, none the less he'd struck her and then had thrown her, perhaps unconscious, into the water. But with what? If he could but make Clyde say that. And then an inspiration. He would take Clyde, and although the law specifically guaranteed accused persons against compulsions, compel him to retrace the scenes of his crime. And although he might not be able to make him commit himself in any way, still once on the ground and facing the exact scene of his crime, his actions might reveal something of the whereabouts of the suit, perhaps, or possibly, some instrument with which he'd struck her. And in consequence, on the third day following Clyde's incarceration, a second visit to Big Bittern with Kraut, Height, Mason, Burton Burley, Earl Newcomb, and Sheriff Slack as his companions, and a slow recanvassing of all the ground he'd first traveled on that dreadful day. And with Kraut, following instructions from Mason, playing up to him in order to ingratiate himself into his good graces, and possibly cause him to make a clean breast of it. For Kraut was to argue that the evidence so far was so convincing that you never would get a jury to believe that you didn't do it, but that if you talked right out to Mason, he could do more for you with the judge and the governor than anyone could, get you off, maybe, with life for 20 years, while this way you're likely to get the chair, sure. Yet Clyde, because of that same fear that had guided him at Bear Lake, maintaining a profound silence. For why should he say that he'd struck her when he'd not, intentionally at least, or with what, since no thought of the camera had come up as yet? At the lake, after definite measurements by the county surveyor as to the distance from the spot where Roberta had drowned to the spot where Clyde had landed, Earl Newcomb suddenly returning to Mason with an important discovery. For under a log, not so far from the spot at which Clyde had stood to remove his wet clothes, the tripod he'd hidden, a little rusty and damp, but of sufficient weight, as Mason and all these others were now ready to believe, to have delivered the blow upon Roberta's skull which had felled her, and so make it possible for him to carry her to the boat and later drown her. Yet, confronted with this, and turning paler than before, Clyde denying that he had a camera or a tripod with him, although Mason was instantly deciding that he would re-question all witnesses to find out whether any recalled seeing a tripod or camera in Clyde's possession. And before the close of this same day, learning from the guide who'd driven Clyde and Roberta over, as well as the boatman who'd seen Clyde drop his bag into the boat, and a young waitress at Grass Lake who'd seen Clyde and Roberta going out from the inn to the station on the morning of their departure from Grass Lake, and that all now recalled a yellow bundle of sticks fastened to his bag, which must have been the very tripod. And then Burton Burley deciding that it might not really have been the tripod, after all, with which he'd struck her, but possibly, and even probably, the somewhat heavier body of the camera itself, since an edge of it would explain the wound on the top of the head, and a flat surface would explain the general wounds on her face. And because of this conclusion, without any knowledge on the part of Clyde, however, Mason securing divers from among the woodsmen of the region, and setting them to diving in the immediate vicinity of the spot where Roberta's body had been found, with the result that after an entire day's diving on the part of 6, and because of promised and substantial reward, one Jack Bogart arose with the very camera which Clyde, as the boat had turned over, had let fall. Worse, after examination, it proved to contain a roll of films, which, upon being submitted to an expert chemist for development, showed finally to be a series of pictures of Roberta made on shore, one sitting on a log, a second posed by the side of the boat on shore, a third reaching up toward the branches of a tree, all very dim and water-soaked, but still decipherable, and the exact measurements of the broader side of the camera corresponding in a general way to the length and breadth of the wounds upon Roberta's face, which caused it now to seem positive that they had discovered the implement wherewith Clyde had delivered the blows. Yet no trace of blood upon the camera itself, and none upon the side or bottom of the boat, which had been brought to Bridgeburg for examination, and none upon the rug which had lain in the bottom of the boat. In Burton Burley there existed as sly a person as might have been found in a score of such backwoods counties as this, and soon he found himself meditating on how easy it would be, supposing irrefragable evidence were necessary, for him or anyone to cut a finger and let it bleed on the rug or the side of the boat or the edge of the camera. Also how easy to take from the head of Roberta 2 or 3 hairs and thread them between the sides of the camera, or about the rowlock to which her veil had been attached, and after due and secret meditation, he actually deciding to visit the Lutz brothers' morgue and secure a few threads of Roberta's hair, for he himself was convinced that Clyde had murdered the girl in cold blood, and for want of a bit of incriminating proof, was such a young, silent, vain crook as this to be allowed to escape? Not if he himself had to twine the hairs about the rowlock or inside the lid of the camera, and then call Mason's attention to them as something overlooked. And in consequence, upon the same day that Hyde and Mason were personally remeasuring the wounds upon Roberta's face and head, Burley slyly threading 2 of Roberta's hairs in between the door and the lens of the camera, so that Mason and Hyde a little while later unexpectedly coming upon them and wondering why they'd not seen them before, nevertheless accepting them immediately as conclusive evidence of Clyde's guilt. Indeed, Mason thereupon announcing that insofar as he was concerned, his case was complete. He had truly traced out every step in this crime, and if need be was prepared to go to trial on the morrow. Yet, because of the very completeness of the testimony, deciding for the present at least not to say anything in connection with the camera, to seal if possible the mouth of everyone who knew, for assuming that Clyde persisted in denying that he carried a camera, or that his own lawyer should be unaware of the existence of such evidence, then how damning in court and out of a clear sky to produce this camera, these photographs of Roberta made by him, and the proof that the very measurements of one side of the camera coincided with the size of the wounds upon her face. How complete! How incriminating! Also, since he personally, having gathered the testimony, was the one best fitted to present it, he decided to communicate with the governor of the state for the purpose of obtaining a special term of the Supreme Court for this district, with its accompanying special session of the local grand jury, which would then be subject to his call at any time. For with this granted, he would be able to impanel a grand jury, and in the event of a true bill being returned against Clyde, then within a month or 6 weeks proceed to trial. Strictly to himself, however, he kept the fact that in view of his own approaching nomination in the ensuing November election, this should all prove most opportune, since, in the absence of any such special term, the case could not possibly be tried before the succeeding regular January term of the Supreme Court, by which time he would be out of office, and although possibly elected to the local judgeship, still not able to try the case in person. And in view of the state of public opinion, which was most bitterly and vigorously anti-Clyde, a quick trial would seem fair and logical to everyone in this local world. But why delay? Why permit such a criminal to sit about and speculate on some plan of escape? And especially when his trial by him, Mason, was certain to rebound to his legal and political and social fame the country over. Chapter 12. And then out of the North Woods a crime sensation of the first magnitude, with all of those intriguingly colorful and yet morally and spiritually atrocious elements, love, romance, wealth, poverty, death, and at once picturesque accounts of where and how Clyde had lived in Lycurgus, with whom he'd been connected, how he'd managed to conceal his relations with one girl, while obviously planning to elope with another, being wired for and published by that type of editor so quick to sense the national news values of crime such as this, and telegrams of inquiry pouring in from New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and other large American cities east and west, either to Mason direct or the representatives of the Associated or United Press in this area, asking for further and more complete details of the crime. Who was this beautiful, wealthy girl, with whom it was said this Griffiths was in love? Where did she live? What were Clyde's exact relations with her? Yet Mason, overawed by the wealth of the Finchleys and the Griffiths, loath to part with Saundra's name, simply asserting for the present that she was the daughter of a very wealthy manufacturer in Lycurgus, whose name he did not care to furnish, yet not hesitating to show the bundle of letters carefully tied with a ribbon by Clyde, but Roberta's letters, on the other hand, being described in detail, even excerpts of some of them, the more poetic and gloomy being furnished the press for use, for who was there to protect her? And on their publication a wave of hatred for Clyde, as well as a wave of pity for her, the poor, lonely country girl who'd had no one but him, and he cruel, faithless, a murderer even. Was not hanging too good for him? For en route to and from Bear Lake, as well as since, Mason had pored over these letters, and because of certain intensely moving passages relating to her home life, her gloomy distress as to her future, her evident loneliness and weariness of heart, he'd been greatly moved, and later had been able to convey his feeling to others, his wife and Height and the local newspaper men, so much so that the latter in particular was sending from Bridgeburg vivid, if somewhat distorted, descriptions of Clyde, his silence, his moodiness, and his hard-heartedness. And then a particularly romantic young reporter from the Star of Utica, arriving at the home of the Aldens, there was immediately given to the world a fairly accurate picture of the weary and defeated Mrs. Alden, who, too exhausted to protest or complain, merely contented herself with a sincere and graphic picture of Roberta's devotion to her parents, her simple ways of living, her modesty, morality, religious devotion. How once the local pastor of the Methodist Church had said that she was the brightest and prettiest and kindest girl he'd ever known, and how for years before leaving home she'd been as her mother's own right hand, and that undoubtedly because of her poverty and loneliness in Lycurgus, she'd been led to listen to the honeyed words of this scoundrel, who, coming to her with promises of marriage, had lured her into this unhallowed and, in her case, all but unbelievable relationship which had led to her death. For she was good and pure and sweet and kind always. And to think that she's dead, I can't believe it. It was so that her mother was quoted. Only Monday a week ago she was about, a little depressed, I thought, but smiling, and for some reason, which I thought odd at the time, went all over the place Monday afternoon and evening, looking at things and gathering some flowers. And then she came over and put her arms around me and said, "I wish I were a little girl again, Mamma, and that you would take me in your arms and rock me like you used to." And I said, "Why, Roberta, what makes you so sad tonight, anyhow?" And she said, "Oh, nothing. You know I'm going back in the morning, and somehow I feel a little foolish about it tonight." And to think that it was this trip that was in her mind. I suppose she had a premonition that all would not work out as she planned. And to think he struck my little girl, she who never could harm anything, not even a fly. And here, in spite of herself, and with a saddened Titus in the background, she began to cry silently. But from the Griffiths and other members of this local social world, complete and almost unbreakable silence. For insofar as Samuel Griffiths was concerned, it was impossible for him at first either to grasp or believe that Clyde could be capable of such a deed. What? That bland and rather timid and decidedly gentlemanly youth, as he saw him, charged with murder, being rather far from Lycurgus at the time, Upper Saranac, where he was reached with difficulty by Gilbert, he was almost unprepared to think, let alone act. Why, how impossible! There must be some mistake here. They must have confused Clyde with someone else. Nevertheless, Gilbert proceeding to explain that it was unquestionably true, since the girl had worked in the factory under Clyde, and the district attorney at Bridgeburg, with whom he'd already been in communication, had assured him that he was in possession of letters which the dead girl had written to Clyde, and that Clyde did not attempt to deny. "Very well, then," countered Samuel. "Don't act hastily, and above all, don't talk to anyone outside of Smiley or Gotboy until I see you. Where's Brookhart?" Referring to Dara Brookhart, of counsel for Griffiths and Company. "He's in Boston today," returned his son. "I think he told me last Friday that he wouldn't be back here until Monday or Tuesday. Well, wire him that I want him to return at once. Incidentally, Have Smiley see if he can arrange with the editors of the Star and Beacon down there to suspend any comment until I get back. I'll be down in the morning. Also tell him to get in the car and run up here, Bridgeburg, today if he can. I must know from first hand all there is to know. Have him see Clyde if he can, also this district attorney, and bring down any news that he can get, and all the newspapers. I want to see for myself what's been published. And at approximately the same time, in the home of the Finchleys on Fourth Lake, Sandra herself, after 48 hours of most macerating thought spent brooding on the astounding climax which had put a period to all her girlish fancies in regard to Clyde, deciding at last to confess all to her father, to whom she was more drawn than to her mother, and accordingly approaching him in the library, where usually he sat after dinner reading or considering his various affairs, but having come within earshot of him, beginning to sob, for truly she was stricken in the matter of her love for Clyde, as well as her various vanities and illusions in regard to her own high position, the scandal that was about to fall on her and her family. Oh, what would her mother say now, after all her warnings, and her father, and Gilbert Griffiths and his affianced bride, and the Cranstons, who, except for her influence over Bertine, would never have been drawn into this intimacy with Clyde? Her sobs arresting her father's attention, he at once paused to look up, the meaning of this quite beyond him, yet instantly sensing something very dreadful, gathering her up in his arms and consolingly murmuring, "There, there, for heaven's sake, what's happened to my little girl now? Who's done what and why?" And then, with a decidedly amazed and shaken expression, listening to a complete confession of all that had occurred thus far, the first meeting with Clyde, her interest in him, the attitude of the Griffiths, her letters, her love, and then this awful accusation and arrest, and if it were true, and her name were used, and her daddy's, and once more she fell to weeping as though her heart would break, yet knowing full well that in the end she would have her father's sympathy and forgiveness, whatever his subsequent suffering and mood. And at once Finchley, accustomed to peace and order and tact and sense in his own home, looking at his daughter in an astounded and critical, and yet not uncharitable way, and exclaiming, "Well, well, of all things! Well, I'll be damned! I'm amazed, my dear. I'm astounded. This is a little too much, I must say. Accused of murder, and with letters of yours in your own handwriting, you say, in his possession, or in the hands of this district attorney, for all we know by now. Damned foolish, Sandra, damned foolish. Your mother's been talking to me for months about this, and you know I was taking your word for it against hers, and now see what's happened. Why couldn't you have told me or listened to her? Why couldn't you have talked all this over with me before going so far? I thought we understood each other, you and I. Your mother and I have always acted for your own good, haven't we? You know that. Besides, I certainly thought you had better sense. Really, I did. But a murder case, and you connected with it. My God!" He got up, a handsome blond man in carefully made clothes, and paced the floor, snapping his fingers irritably, while Sandra continued to weep. Suddenly, ceasing his walking, he turned again toward her and resumed with, "But there's no use crying over it. Crying isn't going to fix it. Of course, we may be able to live it down in some way. I don't know. I can't guess what effect this is likely to have on you personally, but one thing is sure, we do want to know something about those letters." And forthwith, and while Sandra wept on, he proceeded first to call his wife in order to explain the nature of the blow, a social blow that was to lurk in her memory as a shadow for the rest of her years, and next to call up Laguerre Atterbury, lawyer, state senator, chairman of the Republican State Central Committee, and his own private counsel for years past, to whom he explained the amazing difficulty in which his daughter now found herself. Also to inquire what was the most advisable thing to be done. "Well, let me see," came from Atterbury. "I wouldn't worry very much if I were you, Mr. Finchley. I think I can do something to straighten this out for you before any real public damage is done. Now, let me see. Who is the district attorney at Cataraqui County, anyhow? I'll have to look that up and get in touch with them and call you back. But never mind. I promise you I'll be able to do something. Keep the letters out of the papers, anyhow. Maybe out of the trial, I'm not sure, but I'm sure I can fix it so that her name will not be mentioned, so don't worry." And then Atterbury, in turn, calling up Mason, whose name he found in his lawyer's directory, and at once arranging for a conference with him, since Mason seemed to think that the letters were most vital to his case, and although he was so much overawed by Atterbury's voice that he was quick to explain that by no means had he planned as yet to use publicly the name of Sandra, or the letters either, but rather to reserve their actuality for the private inspection of the grand jury, unless Clyde should choose to confess and avoid a trial. But Atterbury, after referring back to Finchley and finding him opposed to any use of the letters whatsoever, or Sandra's name either, assuring him that on the morrow or the day after he would himself proceed to Bridgeburg with some plans and political information which might cause Mason to think twice before he so much as considered referring to Sandra in any public way. And then, after due consideration by the Finchley family, it was decided that at once, and without explanation or apology to anyone, Mrs. Finchley, Stewart, and Sandra should leave for the Maine coast or any place satisfactory to them. Finchley himself proposed to return to Lycurgus and Albany. It was not wise for any of them to be about where they could be reached by reporters or questioned by friends, and forthwith a hajara of the Finchleys to Narragansett, where under the name of Wilson they secluded themselves for the next 6 weeks. Also, and because of the same cause, the immediate removal of the Cranstons to one of the 1,000 Islands, where there was a summer colony not entirely unsatisfactory to their fancy. But on the part of the Baggots and the Harriets, the contention that they were not sufficiently incriminated to bother, and so remaining exactly where they were at 12th Lake. But all talking of Clyde and Sandra, this horrible crime, and the probable social destruction of all those who had in any way been thus innocently defiled by it. And in the interim, Smiley, as directed by Griffiths, proceeding to Bridgeburg, and after 2 long hours with Mason, calling at the jail to see Clyde, and because of authorization from Mason being permitted to see him quite alone in his cell, Smiley having explained that it was not the intention of the Griffiths to try to set up any defense for Clyde, but rather to discover whether under the circumstances there was a possibility for a defense, Mason had urged upon him the wisdom of persuading Clyde to confess, since, as he insisted, there was not the slightest doubt as to his guilt, and a trial would but cost the county money without result to Clyde, whereas, if he chose to confess, there might be some undeveloped reasons for clemency. At any rate, a great social scandal prevented from being aired in the papers. And thereupon Smiley proceeded to Clyde in his cell, where, brooding most darkly and hopelessly, he was wondering how to do. Yet at the mere mention of Smiley's name, shrinking as though struck, the Griffiths, Samuel Griffiths and Gilbert, their personal representative. And now what would he say? For no doubt, as he now argued with himself, Smiley, having talked with Mason, would think him guilty. And what was he to say now? What sort of a story tell? The truth or what? But without much time to think, for even while he was trying to do so, Smiley had been ushered into his presence. And then, moistening his dry lips with his tongue, he could only achieve, "Why, how do you do, Mr. Smiley?" To which the latter replied with a mock geniality, "Why, hello, Clyde. Certainly sorry to see you tied up in a place like this." And then continuing, "The papers and the district attorney over here are full of a lot of stuff about some trouble you're in, but I suppose there can't be much to it. There must be some mistake, of course, and that's what I'm up here to find out. Your uncle telephoned me this morning that I was to come up and see you to find out how they come to be holding you. Of course you can understand how they feel down there, so they wanted me to come up and get the straight of it, so as to get the charge dismissed if possible. So now, if you'll just let me know the ins and outs of this, you know, that is—" He paused there, confident, because of what the district attorney had just told him, as well as Clyde's peculiarly nervous and recessive manner, that he would not have very much that was exculpatory to reveal. And Clyde, after moistening his lips once more, beginning with, "I suppose things do look pretty bad for me, Mr. Smiley. I didn't think at the time that I'd met Miss Alden that I would ever get into such a scrape as this. But I didn't kill her, and that's the God's truth. I never even wanted to kill her or take her up to that lake in the first place, and that's the truth, and that's what I told the district attorney. I know he has some letters from her to me, but they only show that she wanted me to go away with her. Not that I wanted to go with her at all." He paused, hoping that Smilly would stamp this with his approval of Faith. And Smilly, noting the agreement between his and Mason's assertions, yet anxious to placate himself, returned, "Yes, I know. He was just showing them to me." "I knew he would," continued Clyde weakly. "But you know how it is sometimes, Mr. Smilly." His voice, because of his fears that the sheriff or Kraut were listening, pitched very low. "A man can get in a jam with a girl when he never even intended to at first. You know that yourself. I did like Roberta at first, and that's the truth, and I did get in with her just as those letters show. But you know that rule they have down there, that no one in charge of a department can have anything to do with any of the women under him. Well, that's what started all the trouble for me, I guess. I was afraid to let anyone know about it in the first place, you see." "Oh, I see." And so by degrees, and growing less and less tense as he proceeded, since Smilly appeared to be listening with sympathy, he now outlined most of the steps of his early intimacy with Roberta, together with his present defense, but with no word as to the camera or the 2 hats or the lawsuit, which things were constantly and enormously troubling him. How could he ever explain these, really? And with Smilly at the conclusion of this, and because of what Mason had told him, asking, "But what about those 2 hats, Clyde? This man over here was telling me that you admit to having 2 straw hats, the one found on the lake, and the one you wore away from there." And Clyde, forced to say something, yet not knowing what, replying, "But they're wrong as to my wearing a straw hat away from there, Mr. Smilly. It was a cap." "I see. But still you did have a straw hat up at Bear Lake, he tells me." "Yes, I had one there. But as I told him, that was the one I had with me when I went up to the Cranstons the first time. I told him that. I forgot it and left it there." "Oh, I see. But now there was something about a suit, a gray one, I believe, that he says you were seen wearing up there, but that he can't find now. Were you wearing one?" "No. I was wearing the blue suit I had on when I came down here. They've taken that away now and given me this one. But he says that you say you had it dry cleaned at Sharon, but that he can't find anyone there who knows anything about it. How about that? Did you have it dry cleaned there?" "Yes, sir." "By whom?" "Well, I can't just remember now, but I think I can find the man if I were to go up there again. He's near the depot." But at the same time looking down and away from Smilly, and then Smilly, like Mason before him, proceeding to ask about the bag in the boat, and whether it had not been possible, if he could swim to shore with his shoes and suit on, for him to have swam to Roberta and assisted her to cling to the overturned boat. And Clyde explaining as before that he was afraid of being dragged down, but adding now for the first time that he'd called to her to hang on to the boat, whereas previously he'd said that the boat drifted away from them. And Smilly recalled that Mason had told him this. Also, in connection with Clyde's story of the wind blowing his hat off, Mason had said he could prove by witnesses, as well as the U.S. government reports, that there was not a breath of air stirring on that most halcyon day. And so plainly Clyde was lying. His story was too thin. Yet Smilly, not wishing to embarrass him, kept saying, "Oh, I see," or "to be sure," or "that's the way it was it?" And then finally asking about the marks on Roberta's face and head, for Mason had called his attention to them, and insisted that no blow from a boat would make both abrasions. But Clyde, sure that the boat had only struck her once, and that all the bruises had come from that, or else he could not guess from what they'd come. But then beginning to see how hopeless was all this explanation, for it was so plain from his restless, troubled manner that Smilly did not believe him. Quite obviously, he considered his not having aided Roberta as dastardly, a thin excuse for letting her die. And so, too weary and disheartened to lie more, finally ceasing, and Smilly too sorry and disturbed to wish to catechize or confuse him further, fidgeting and fumbling and finally declaring, "Well, I'm afraid I'll have to be going now, Clyde. The roads are pretty bad between here and Sharon, but I've been mighty glad to hear your side of it, and I'll present it to your uncle just as you told it to me. But in the meantime, if I were you, I wouldn't do any more talking than I could help, not until you hear further from me. I was instructed to find an attorney up here to handle this case for you if I could, But since it's late and Mr. Brookhart, our chief counsel, will be back tomorrow, I think I'll just wait until I can talk to him. So if you'll take my advice, you'll just not say anything until you hear from him or me. Either he'll come or he'll send someone. He'll bring a letter from me, whoever he is, and then he'll advise you." And with this parting admonition, leaving Clyde to his thoughts and himself feeling no least doubt of his guilt, and that nothing less than Griffith's millions, if so they chose to spend them, could save him from a fate which was no doubt due him. Chapter 13. And on the following morning Samuel Griffiths, with his own son Gilbert standing by, in the large drawing-room of their Waikiki Avenue mansion, listening to Smiley's report of his conference with Clyde and Mason, and Smiley reporting all he'd heard and seen, and with Gilbert Griffiths, unbelievably shaken and infuriated by all this, exclaiming at one point, "Why, the little devil! The little beast! But what did I tell you, Dad? Didn't I warn you against bringing him on?" And Samuel Griffiths, after meditating on this reference to his earlier sympathetic folly, now giving Gilbert a most suggestive and intensely troubled look, which said, "Are we here to discuss the folly of my original, if foolish, good intentions, or the present crisis?" And Gilbert thinking, "The murderer! And that wretched little show-off Sandra Finchley, trying to make something of him in order to spite me, Gilbert principally, and so getting herself smirched. The little fool! But it served her right. She would get her share of this now, only it would cause him and his father and all of them infinite trouble also. For was this not an ineradicable stain which was likely to defile all, himself, his fiancée, Bella, Myra, his parents, and perhaps cost them their position here in Lycurgus society? The tragedy, maybe an execution, and in this family. Yet Samuel Griffiths, on his part, going back in his mind to all that had occurred since Clyde had arrived in Lycurgus, his being left to work in that basement at first and ignored by the family, left to his own devices for fully 8 months, might not that have been at least a contributing cause to all this horror? And then being put over all those girls, was not that a mistake? He could see all this now clearly, although by no means condoning Clyde's deed in any way, far from it. The wretchedness of such a mind as that, the ungoverned and carnal desires, the uncontrollable brutality of seducing that girl, and then because of Sandra, the pleasant, agreeable little Sandra, plotting to get rid of her, and now in jail, and offering no better explanation of all the amazing circumstances, as reported by Smiley, than that he had not intended to kill her at all, had not even plotted to do so, that the wind had blown his hat off. How impossibly weak, and with no suitable explanation for the 2 hats or the missing suit, or of not going to the aid of the drowning girl, and those unexplained marks on her face. How strongly all these things pointed to his guilt. "For God's sake," exclaimed Gilbert, "hasn't he anything better than that to offer, the little fool?" And Smiley replied that that was all he could get him to say, and that Mr. Mason was absolutely and quite dispassionately convinced of his guilt. "Dreadful, dreadful," put in Samuel. "I really can't grasp it yet. I can't. It doesn't seem possible that anyone of my blood could be guilty of such a thing." And then getting up and walking the floor in real and crushing distress and fear. His family, Gilbert and his future, Bella with all her ambitions and dreams, and Sandra and Finchley. He clenched his hands, he knitted his brows and tightened his lips. He looked at Smiley, who, immaculate and sleek, showed nevertheless the immense strain that was on him, shaking his head dismally whenever Griffiths looked at him. And then, after nearly an hour and a half more of such questioning and re-questioning as to the possibility of some other interpretation than the data furnished by Smiley would permit, Griffiths senior pausing and declaring, "Well, it does look bad, I must say. Still, in the face of what you tell me, I can't find it in me to condemn completely without more knowledge than we have here. There may be some other facts not as yet come to light. He won't talk, you say, about most things, some details we don't know about, some slight excuse of some kind. For without that, this does appear to be a most atrocious crime. Has Mr. Brookhart got in from Boston?" "Yes, sir, he's here," replied Gilbert. "He telephoned Mr. Smiley." "Well, have him out here at 2 this afternoon to see me. I'm too tired to talk more about this right now. Tell him all that you told me, Smiley, and then come back here with him at 2. It may be that he will have some suggestion to make that will be of value to us, although just what I can't see. Only one thing I want to say. I hope he isn't guilty, and I want every proper step taken to discover whether he is or not, and if not, to defend him to the limit of the law. But no more than that. No trying to save anybody who is guilty of such a thing as this. No, 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 not even if he is my nephew. Not me. I'm not that kind of a man. Trouble or no trouble, disgrace or no disgrace, I'll do what I can to help him if he's innocent, if there's even the faintest reason for believing so. But guilty? No, never. If this boy is really guilty, he'll have to take the consequences. Not a dollar, not a penny of my money will I devote to anyone who could be guilty of such a crime, even if he is my nephew. And turning and slowly and heavily moving toward the rear staircase, while Smelly, wide-eyed, gazed after him in awe. The power of him, the decision of him, the fairness of him in such a deadly crisis. And Gilbert, equally impressed, also sitting and staring. His father was a man, really. He might be cruelly wounded and distressed, but unlike himself, he was neither petty nor revengeful. And next Mr. Dara Brookhart, a large, well-dressed, well-fed, ponderous, and cautious corporation lawyer, with one eye half concealed by a drooping lid, and his stomach rather protuberant, giving one the impression of being mentally, if not exactly physically, suspended, balloon-wise, in some highly rarefied atmosphere where he was moved easily hither and yon by the lightest breath of previous legal interpretations or decisions of any kind. In absence of the additional facts, the guilt of Clyde to him seemed obvious, or waiving that, as he saw it after carefully listening to Smilly's recounting of all the suspicious and incriminating circumstances. He would think it very difficult to construct an even partially satisfactory defense, unless there were some facts favoring Clyde which had not thus far appeared. Those 2 hats, that bag, his slipping away like that, those letters. But he would prefer to read them, for upon the face of the data so far, unquestionably public sentiment would be all against Clyde and in favor of the dead girl and her poverty and her class, a situation which made a favorable verdict in such a backwoods county seat as Bridgeburg almost impossible. For Clyde, although himself poor, was the nephew of a rich man, and hitherto in good standing in Lycurgus society. That would most certainly tend to prejudice country-born people against him. It would probably be better to ask for a change of venue, so as to nullify the force of such a prejudice. On the other hand, without first sending a trained cross-examiner to Clyde, one who, being about to undertake the defense, should be able to extract the facts from him on the plea that on his truthful answers depended his life, he would not be able to say whether there was any hope or not. In his office was a certain Mr. Catchman, a very able man, who might be sent on such a mission, and on whose final report one could base a reasonable opinion. However, there were now various other aspects of such a case as this which, in his estimation, needed to be carefully looked into and decided upon. For, of course, as Mr. Griffiths and his son so well knew, in Utica, New York City, Albany, and now that he came to think of it, more particularly in Albany, where were 2 brothers, Canavan and Canavan, most able, if dubious, individuals, there were criminal lawyers deeply versed in the abstrusities and tricks of the criminal law, and any of them, no doubt, or a sufficient retainer, and irrespective of the primary look of a situation of this kind, might be induced to undertake such a defense. This book is continued on cassette number 4, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape. An American Tragedy, Part 2, continuing on cassette number 4, side 1. No doubt via change of venue, motions, appeals, etc., they might and no doubt would be able to delay and eventually effect an ultimate verdict of something less than death, if such were the wish of the head of this very important family. On the other hand, there was the undeniable fact that such a hotly contested trial, as this would most assuredly prove to be, would result in an enormous amount of publicity. And did Mr. Samuel Griffiths want that? For again, under such circumstances, Was it not likely to be said, if most unjustly, of course, that he was using his great wealth to frustrate justice? The public was so prejudiced against wealth in such cases, yet some sort of a defense on the part of the Griffiths would certainly be expected by the public, whether subsequently the same necessity for such defense was criticized by them or not. And in consequence it was now necessary for Mr. Griffiths and his son to decide how they would prefer to proceed, whether with very distinguished criminal lawyers, such as the two he just named, or with less forceful counsel, or none. For of course it would be possible, and that quite inconspicuously, to supply Clyde with a capable and yet thoroughly conservative trial lawyer, someone residing and practicing in Bridgeburg possibly, whose duty it would be to see that all blatant and unjustified reference to the family on the part of the newspapers was minimized. And so, after 3 more hours of conference, it was finally decided by Samuel himself that at once Mr. Brookhart was to dispatch Mr. Catcherman to Bridgeburg to interview Clyde, and thereafter, whatever his conclusions as to his guilt or innocence, he was to select from the local array of legal talent, for the present anyhow, such a lawyer as would best represent Clyde fairly, yet with no assurances of means or encouragement to do more than extract from Clyde the true details of his relationship to this charge, and those once ascertained to center upon such a defense as would most honestly tend to establish only such facts as were honestly favorable to Clyde. In short, in no way, either by legal chicane or casuistry or trickery of any kind, to seek to establish a false innocence and so defeat the ends of justice. Chapter 14. Mr. Catcherman did not prove by any means to be the one to extract from Clyde anything more than had either Mason or Smiley. Although shrewd to a degree in piecing together out of the muddled statements of another such data as seemed most probable, still he was not so successful in the realm of the emotions as was necessary in the case of Clyde. He was too legal, chilling, unemotional, and in consequence, after grilling Clyde for 4 long hours one hot July afternoon, he was eventually compelled to desist with a feeling that as a plotter of crime, Clyde was probably the most arresting example of feeble and blundering incapacity he'd ever met. For since Smiley's departure, Mason had proceeded to the shores of Big Bittern with Clyde, and there discovered the tripod and camera, also listened to more of Clyde's lies, and as he now explained to Catcherman that, while Clyde denied owning a camera, nevertheless he had proof that he did own one, and had taken it with him when he left Lycurgus. Yet when confronted with this fact by Catcherman, as the latter now noticed, Clyde had nothing to say other than that he had not taken a camera with him, and that the tripod found was not the one belonging to any camera of his, a lie which so irritated Catcherman that he decided not to argue with him further. At the same time, however, Brookhart having instructed him that, whatever his personal conclusions in regard to Clyde, a lawyer of sorts was indispensable, the charity if not the honor of the Griffiths being this much involved, the Western Griffiths, as Brookhart had already explained to him, having nothing and not being wanted in the case anyhow, he decided that he must find one before leaving. In consequence, and without any knowledge of the local political situation, he proceeded to the office of Ira Kellogg, president of the Cataraqui County National Bank, who, although Catcherman did not know it, was high in the councils of the Democratic organization. And because of his religious and moral views, this same Kellogg was already highly incensed and irritated by the crime of which Clyde was accused. On the other hand, however, because as he well knew this case was likely to pave the way for an additional Republican sweep at the approaching primaries, he was not blind to the fact that some reducing opposition to Mason might not be amiss. Fate seemed too obviously to be favoring the Republican machine in the person of and crime committed by Clyde, for since the discovery of this murder, Mason had been basking in such publicity and even nationwide notoriety as had not befallen any district attorney of this region in years and years. Newspaper correspondents and reporters and illustrators from such distant cities as Buffalo, Rochester, Chicago, New York, and Boston were already arriving, as everybody knew or saw, to either interview or make sketches or take photos of Clyde, Mason, the surviving members of the Alden family, etc., while locally Mason was the recipient of undiluted praise, even the Democratic voters in the county joining with the Republicans in assuring each other that Mason was all right, that he was handling this young murderer in the way that he deserved to be handled, and that neither the wealth of the Griffiths nor the family of that rich girl whom he appeared to have been trying to capture was influencing this young tribune of the people in the least. He was a real attorney. He had not allowed any grass to grow under his feet, you bet. Indeed, previous to Catchman's visit, a coroner's jury had been called, with Mason attending and directing even, the verdict being that the dead girl had come to her death through a plot devised and executed by one Clyde Griffiths, who was then and there in the county jail of Bridgeburg, and that he be held to await the verdict of the county grand jury, to whom his crime was soon to be presented. And Mason, through an appeal to the governor, as all now knew, was planning to secure a special sitting of the Supreme Court, which would naturally involve an immediate session of the county grand jury in order to hear the evidence and either indict or discharge Clyde. And now, Catchman arriving to inquire where he was likely to find a local lawyer of real ability who could be trusted to erect some sort of a defense for Clyde. And immediately, as an offset to all this, there popped into Kellogg's mind the name and reputation of one Honorable Alvin Belknap, of Belknap and Jeffson, of this same city, an individual who'd been twice state senator, 3 times Democratic assemblyman from this region, and more recently looked upon by various Democratic politicians as one who would be favored with higher honors as soon as it was possible to arrange an issue which would permit the Democrats to enter into local office. In fact, only 3 years before, in a contest with Mason for the district attorneyship, this same Belknap had run closer to victory than any other candidate on the Democratic ticket. Indeed, so rounded a man was he politically, that this year he had been slated for that very county judgeship nomination which Mason had in view, and but for this sudden and most amazing development in connection with Clyde, it had been quite generally assumed that Belknap, once nominated, would be elected. And although Mr. Kellogg did not quite trouble to explain to Catchman all the complicated details of this very interesting political situation, he did explain that Mr. Belknap was a very exceptional man, almost the ideal one, if one were looking for an opponent to Mason. And with this slight introduction, Kellogg now offered personally to conduct Catchman to Belknap and Jeffson's office, just across the way in the Bowers block. And then, knocking at Belknap's door, they were admitted by a brisk, medium-sized, and most engaging-looking man of about 48, whose gray-blue eyes at once fixed themselves in the mind of Catchman as the psychic windows of a decidedly shrewd, if not altogether masterful and broad-gauge man. For Belknap was inclined to carry himself with an air which all were inclined to respect. He was a college graduate, and in his youth, because of his looks, his means, and his local social position, his father had been a judge as well as a national senator from here, he'd seen so much of what might be called near-city life that all those gaucheries, as well as sex inhibitions and sex longings, which still so greatly troubled and motivated and even marked a man like Mason, had long since been covered with an easy manner and social understanding which made him fairly capable of grasping any reasonable moral or social complication which life was prepared to offer. Indeed, he was one who naturally would approach a case such as Clyde's with less vehemence and fever than did Mason. For once in his 20th year, he himself had been trapped between 2 girls, with one of whom he was merely playing, while being seriously in love with the other, and having seduced the first and being confronted with an engagement or flight, he'd chosen flight, but not before laying the matter before his father, by whom he was advised to take a vacation, during which time the services of the family doctor were engaged, with the result that for $1,000 in expenses necessary to house the pregnant girl in Utica, the father had finally extricated his son and made possible his return and eventual marriage to the other girl. And therefore, while by no means sympathizing with the more cruel and drastic phases of Clyde's attempt at escape, as so far charged, never in all the years of his law practice had he been able to grasp the psychology of a murderer. Still, because of the rumored existence and love influence of a rich girl, whose name had not as yet been divulged, he was inclined to suspect that Clyde had been emotionally betrayed or bewitched. Was he not poor and vain and ambitious? He'd heard so, had even been thinking that he, the local political situation being what it was, might advantageously to himself, and perhaps most disruptingly to the dreams of Mr. Mason, be able to construct a defense, or at least a series of legal contentions and delays which might make it not so easy for Mr. Mason to walk away with the county judgeship as he imagined. Might it not, by brisk legal moves now, and even in the face of this rising public sentiment, or because of it, be possible to ask for a change of venue, or time to develop new evidence, in which case a trial might not occur before Mr. Mason was out of office? He and his young and somewhat new associate, Mr. Reuben Jeffson, of quite recently the state of Vermont, had been thinking of it. And now Mr. Catchman, accompanied by Mr. Kellogg, and thereupon a conference with Mr. Catchman and Mr. Kellogg, with the latter arguing quite politically the wisdom of his undertaking such a defense, and his own interest in the case being what it was, he was not long in deciding, after a conference with his younger associate, that he would. In the long run it could not possibly injure him politically, however the public might feel about it now. And then Catchman, having handed over a retainer to Belknap, as well as a letter introducing him to Clyde, Belknap had Jeffson call up Mason to inform him that Belknap and Jeffson, as counsel for Samuel Griffiths on behalf of his nephew, would require of him a detailed written report of all the charges, as well as all the evidence thus far accumulated, the minutes of the autopsy, and the report of the coroner's inquest. Also information as to whether any appeal for a special term of the Supreme Court had as yet been acted upon, and if so, what judge had been named to sit, and when and where the grand jury would be gathered. Incidentally, he said, Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson, having heard that Miss Alden's body had been sent to her home for burial, would request at once a counsel's agreement whereby it might be exhumed, in order that other doctors now to be called by the defense might be permitted to examine it, a proposition which Mason at once sought to oppose, but finally agreed to rather than submit to an order from a Supreme Court judge. These details having been settled, Belknap announced that he was going over to the jail to see Clyde. It was late, and he had had no dinner, and might get none now, but he wanted to have a heart-to-heart with this youth, whom Catchman informed him he would find very difficult. But Belknap, buoyed up as he was by his opposition to Mason, his conviction that he was in a good mental state to understand Clyde, was in a high degree of legal curiosity. The romance and drama of this crime. What sort of a girl was this Saundra Finchley, of whom he had already heard through secret channels? And could she by any chance be brought to Clyde's defense? He'd already understood that her name was not to be mentioned, high politics demanding this. He was really most eager to talk to this sly and ambitious and futile youth. However, on reaching the jail, and after showing Sheriff Slack a letter from Catchman, and asking as a special favor to himself that he be taken upstairs to some place near Clyde's cell, in order that unannounced he might first observe Clyde, he was quietly led to the second floor, and the outside door leading to the corridor which faced Clyde's cell being opened for him, allowed to enter there alone. And then walking to within a few feet of Clyde's cell, he was able to view him, at the moment lying face down on his iron cot, his arms above his head, a tray of untouched food standing in the aperture, his body sprawled and limp. For since Catchman's departure, and his second failure to convince anyone of his futile and meaningless lies, he was more despondent than ever. In fact, so low was his condition that he was actually crying, his shoulders heaving above his silent emotion. At sight of this, and remembering his own youthful escapades, Belknap now felt intensely sorry for him. No soulless murderer, as he saw it, would cry. Approaching Clyde's cell door, after a pause, he began with, "Come, come, Clyde, this will never do. You mustn't give up like this. Your case mayn't be as hopeless as you think. Wouldn't you like to sit up and talk to a lawyer fellow who thinks he might be able to do something for you? Belknap is my name, Alvin Belknap. I live right here in Bridgeburg, and I've been sent over by that other fellow who was here a while ago. Catchman, wasn't that his name? You didn't get along with him so very well, did you? Well, I didn't either. He's not our kind, I guess. But here's a letter from him authorizing me to represent you. Want to see it?" He poked it genially and authoritatively through the narrow bars toward which Clyde, now curious and dubious, approached, for there was something so whole-hearted and unusual and seemingly sympathetic and understanding in this man's voice that Clyde took courage, and without hesitancy, therefore, he took the letter and looked at it, then returned it with a smile. "There, I thought so," went on Belknap, most convincingly and pleased with his effect, which he credited entirely to his own magnetism and charm. "That's better. I know we're going to get along. I can feel it. You're going to be able to talk to me as easily and truthfully as you would to your mother, and without any fear that any word of anything you ever tell me is going to reach another ear unless you want it to, see? For I'm going to be your lawyer, Clyde, if you'll let me, and you're going to be my client, and we're going to sit down together tomorrow, or whenever you say so, and you're going to tell me all you think I ought to know, and I'm going to tell you what I think I ought to know, and whether I'm going to be able to help you. And I'm going to prove to you that in every way that you help me, you're helping yourself, see? And I'm going to do my damnedest to get you out of this. Now, how's that, Clyde?" He smiled most encouragingly and sympathetically, even affectionately, and Clyde, feeling for the first time since his arrival here that he'd found someone in whom he could possibly confide without danger, was already thinking it might be best if he should tell this man all, everything. He could not have said why, quite, but he liked him. In a quick, if dim way, he felt that this man understood, and might even sympathize with him, if he knew all, or nearly all. And after Belknap had detailed how eager this enemy of his Mason was to convict him, and how, if he could but devise a reasonable defense, he was sure he could delay the case until this man was out of office, Clyde announced that if he would give him the night to think it all out, tomorrow or any time he chose to come back, he would tell him all. And then the next day Belknap, sitting on a stool and munching chocolate bars, listened while Clyde before him on his iron cart poured forth his story, all the details of his life since arriving at Lycurgus, how and why he'd come there, the incident of the slain child in Kansas City, without, however, mention of the clipping which he himself had preserved and then forgotten, his meeting with Roberta and his desire for her pregnancy, and how he'd sought to get her out of it. On and on until, she having threatened to expose him, he had at last, and in great distress and fright, found the item in the Times-Union and had sought to emulate that in action. But he'd never plotted it personally, as Belknap was to understand, nor had he intentionally killed her at the last. No, he had not. Mr. Belknap must believe that, whatever else he thought. He had never deliberately struck her. No, no, no. It had been an accident. There had been a camera, and the tripod reported to have been found by Mason was unquestionably his tripod. Also, he'd hidden it under a log after accidentally striking Roberta with a camera, and then seeing that sink under the waters, where no doubt it still was, and with pictures of himself and Roberta on the film it contained, if they were not dissolved by the water. But he'd not struck her intentionally. No, he'd not. She'd approached, and he'd struck, but not intentionally. The boat had upset, and then, as nearly as he could, he described how before that he'd seemed to be in a trance almost, because having gone so far he could go no farther. But in the meantime Belknap, himself finally wearied and confused by this strange story, the impossibilities he now saw it of submitting to, let alone convincing any ordinary backwoods jury of this region of the innocence of these dark and bitter plans and deeds, finally in great weariness and uncertainty and mental confusion, even, getting up and placing his hands on Clyde's shoulders, saying, "Well, that'll be enough of this for today, Clyde, I think. I see how you felt, and how it all came about. Also, I see how tired you are, and I'm mighty glad you've been able to give me the straight of this, because I know how hard it's been for you to do it. But I don't want you to talk any more now. There are going to be other days, and I have a few things I want to attend to before I take up some of the minor phases of this with you tomorrow or next day. Just you sleep and rest for the present. You'll need all you can get for the work both of us will have to do a little later. But just now you're not to worry, because there's no need of it, you see. I'll get you out of this, or we will, my partner and I. I have a partner that I'm going to bring around here presently. You'll like him, too. But there are one or two things that I want you to think about and stick to. And one of these is that you're not to let anybody frighten you into anything, because either myself or my partner will be around here once a day anyhow, and anything you have to say or want to know you can say or find out from us. Next, you're not to talk to anybody. Mason, the sheriff, these jailers, no one, unless I tell you to. No one, do you hear? And above all things, don't cry any more, for if you are as innocent as an angel or as black as the devil himself, the worst thing you can do is to cry before anyone. The public and these jail officers don't understand that. They invariably look upon it as weakness or confession of guilt. And I don't want them to feel any such thing about you now, and especially when I know that you're really not guilty. I know that now. I believe it. See? So keep a stiff upper lip before Mason and everybody. In fact, from now on I want you to try and laugh a little, or at any rate smile, and pass the time of day with these fellows around here. There's an old saying in law, you know, that the consciousness of innocence makes any man calm. Think and look innocent. Don't sit and brood and look as though you'd lost your last friend, because you haven't. I'm here, and so is my partner, Mr. Jeffson. I'll bring him round here in a day or two, and you're to look and act toward him exactly as you have toward me. Trust him, because in legal matters he's even smarter than I am in some ways. And tomorrow I'm going to bring you a couple of books and some magazines and papers, and I want you to read them or look at the pictures. They'll help keep your mind off your troubles." Clyde achieved a rather feeble smile and nodded his head. "From now on, too. I don't know whether you're at all religious, but whether you are or not, they hold services here in the jail on Sundays, and I want you to attend them regularly. That is, if they ask you to. For this is a religious community, and I want you to make as good an impression as you can. Never mind what people say or how they look. You do as I tell you. And if this fellow Mason or any of those fellows around here get to pestering you any more, send me a note. And now I'll be going. So give me a cheerful smile as I go out, and another one as I come in. And don't talk, see?" Then, shaking Clyde briskly by the shoulders and slapping him on the back, he strode out, actually thinking to himself, "But do I really believe that this fellow is as innocent as he says? Would it be possible for a fellow to strike a girl like that, and not know that he was doing it intentionally? And then swimming away afterwards because, as he says, if he went nearer he thought he might drown too? Bad, bad. What 12 men are going to believe that? And that bag, those 2 hats, that missing suit. And yet he swears he didn't intentionally strike her. But what about all that planning, the intent, which is just as bad in the eyes of the law? Is he telling the truth, or is he lying even now, perhaps trying to deceive himself as well as me? And that camera, we ought to get hold of that before Mason finds it and introduces it. And that suit, I ought to find that and mention it, maybe, so as to offset the look of its being hidden. Say that we had it all the time, and send it to Lycurgus to be cleaned. But no, wait a minute. I must think about that. And so on, point by point, while deciding wearily that perhaps it would be better not to attempt to use Clyde's story at all, but rather to concoct some other story, this one changed or modified in some way, which would make it appear less cruel or legally murderous. Chapter 15. Mr. Reuben Jeffson was decidedly different from Belknap, Catcherman, Mason, Smiley, in fact anyone thus far who'd seen Clyde or become legally interested in this case. He was young, tall, thin, rugged, brown, cool, but not cold spiritually, and with the will and determination of the tensile strength of steel, and with a mental and legal equipment which for shrewdness and self-interest was not unlike that of a lynx or a ferret. Those shrewd, steel, very light blue eyes in his brown face, the force and curiosity of the long nose, the strength of the hands and the body. He had lost no time. As soon as he discovered that there was a possibility of Belknap and Jeffson, taking over the defense of Clyde, in going over the minutes of the coroner's inquest, as well as the doctor's reports and the letters of Roberta and Sandra. And now, being faced by Belknap, who was explaining that Clyde did now actually admit having plotted to kill Roberta, although not having actually done so, since at the fatal moment some cataleptic state of mind or remorse had intervened and caused him to unintentionally strike her, he merely stared without the shadow of a smile or comment of any kind. But he wasn't in such a state when he went out there with her, though. No. Nor when he swam away afterwards. No. Nor when he went through those woods, or changed to another suit and hat, or hid that tripod. No. Of course, you know, constructively, in the eyes of the law, if we use his own story, he's just as guilty as though he'd struck her, and the judge would have to so instruct. Yes, I know. I've thought of all that. Well, then, I'll tell you, Jeffson, it's a tough case and no mistake. It looks to me now as though Mason has all the cards. If we can get this chap off, we can get anybody off. But as I see it, I'm not so sure that we want to mention that cataleptic business yet. At least not unless we want to enter a plea of insanity or emotional insanity or something like that. About like that Harry Thor case, for instance. He paused and scratched his slightly graying temple dubiously. "You think he's guilty, of course?" interpolated Jeffson dryly. "Well, now, as astonishing as it may seem to you, no. At least I'm not positive that I do. To tell you the truth, this is one of the most puzzling cases I've ever run up against. This fellow is by no means as hard as you think, or as cold. Quite a simple, affectionate chap in a way, as you'll see for yourself. His manner, I mean. He's only 21 or 2, and for all his connections with these Griffiths, he's very poor. Just a clerk, really. And he tells me that his parents are poor, too. They run a mission of some kind out west, Denver, I believe, and before that in Kansas City. He hasn't been home in 4 years. In fact, he got into some crazy boy scrape out there in Kansas City when he was working for one of the hotels as a bellboy and had to run away. That's something we've got to look out for in connection with Mason, whether he knows about that or not. It seems he and a bunch of other bellhops took some rich fellow's car without his knowing it, and then because they were afraid of being late, they ran over and killed a little girl. We've got to find out about that and prepare for it, or if Mason does know about it, he'll spring it at the trial, and just when he thinks we're least expecting it. "Well, he won't pull that one," replied Jeffson, his hard electric blue eyes gleaming. "Not if I have to go to Kansas City to find out." And Belknap went on to tell Jeffson all that he knew about Clyde's life up to the present time. How he'd worked at dishwashing, waiting on tables, soda clerking, driving a wagon, anything and everything before he'd arrived in Lycurgus. How he'd always been fascinated by girls. How he had first met Roberta and later Sandra. Finally, how he found himself trapped by one and desperately in love with the other, whom he could not have unless he got rid of the first one. "And notwithstanding all that, you feel a doubt as to whether he did kill her?" asked Jeffson, at the conclusion of all this. "Yes, as I say, I'm not at all sure that he did, but I do know that he still hipped over the second girl. His manner changed whenever he or I happened to mention her. Once, for instance, I asked him about his relations with her, and in spite of the fact that he's accused of seducing and killing this other girl, he looked at me as though I'd said something I shouldn't have, insulted him or her." And here Belknap smiled a wry smile, while Jeffson, his long bony legs propped against the walnut desk before him, merely stared at him. "You don't say," he finally observed. "And not only that," went on Belknap, "but he said, 'Why, no, of course not. She wouldn't allow anything like that. And besides,' and then he stopped. "And besides what, Clyde?" I asked. "Well, you don't want to forget who she is." "Oh, I see," I said. And then, will you believe it, he wanted to know if there wasn't some way by which her name and those letters she wrote him couldn't be kept out of the papers and this case. Her family prevented from knowing so that she and they wouldn't be hurt too much. Not really. But what about the other girl? That's just the point I'm trying to make. He could plot to kill one girl, and maybe even did kill her, for all I know, after seducing her, but because he was being so sculled around by his grand ideas of this other girl, he didn't quite know what he was doing, really. Don't you see? You know how it is with some of these young fellows of his age, and especially when they've never had anything much to do with girls or money, and want to be something grand. You think that made him a little crazy, maybe? Put in Jeffson. Well, it's possible. Confused, hypnotized, loony, you know. A brainstorm, as they say down in New York. But he certainly is still cracked over that other girl. In fact, I think most of his crying in jail is over her. He was crying, you know, when I went in to see him, sobbing as if his heart would break." Meditatively, Belknap scratched his right ear. "But just the same, there certainly is something to this other idea, that his mind was turned by all this, that Alden girl forcing him on the one hand to marry her, while the other girl was offering to marry him. I know. I was once in such a scrape myself." And here he paused to relate that to Jeffson. "By the way," he went on, "he says we can find that item about that other couple drowning in the Times-Union of about June 18th or 19th. "All right," replied Jeffson, "I'll get it. What I want you to do tomorrow," continued Belknap, "is to go over there with me and see what impression you get of him. I'll be there to see if he tells it all to you in the same way. I want your own individual viewpoint of him." "You most certainly will get it," snapped Jeffson. Belknap and Jeffson proceeded the next day to visit Clyde in jail, and Jeffson, after interviewing him and meditating once more on his strange story, was even then not quite able to make up his mind whether Clyde was as innocent of intending to strike Roberta as he said or not, or if he were, how could he have swum away afterward, leaving her to drown? Decidedly it would be more difficult for a jury than for himself even to be convinced. At the same time, there was that contention of Belknap's as to the possibility of Clyde's having been mentally upset or unbalanced at the time that he accepted the Times-Union plot and proceeded to act on it. That might be true, of course, yet personally, to Jeffson at least, Clyde appeared to be wise and sane enough now. As Jeffson saw him, he was harder and more cunning than Belknap was willing to believe. A cunning modified, of course, by certain soft and winning social graces, for which one could hardly help liking him. However, Clyde was by no means as willing to confide in Jeffson as he'd been in Belknap, an attitude which did little to attract Jeffson to him at first. At the same time, there was about Jeffson a hard, integrated earnestness which soon convinced Clyde of his technical, if not his emotional, interest. And after a while he began looking toward this younger man, even more than toward Belknap, as the one who might do most for him. "Of course you know that those letters which Miss Alden wrote you are very strong," began Jeffson, after hearing Clyde restate his story. "Yes, sir. They're very sad to anyone who doesn't know all of the facts, and on that account they're likely to prejudice any jury against you, especially when they're put alongside Miss Finchley's letters." "Yes, I suppose they might," replied Clyde. "But then, she wasn't always like that either. It was only after she got in trouble, and I wanted her to let me go, that she wrote like that." I know. And that's a point we want to think about and maybe bring out if we can. If only there was some way to keep those letters out." He now turned to Belknap to say, then to Clyde, "But what I want to ask you now is this. You were close to her for something like a year, weren't you?" "Yes." "In all of that time that you were with her, or before, was she ever friendly or maybe intimate with any other young man anywhere, that is, that you know of?" As Clyde could see, Jeffson was not afraid, or perhaps not sufficiently sensitive, to refrain from presenting any thought or trick that seemed to him likely to provide a loophole for escape. But far from being cheered by this suggestion, he was really shocked. What a shameful thing in connection with Roberta and her character it would be to attempt to introduce any such lie as this. He could not and would not hint at any such falsehood, and so he replied, "No, sir. I never heard of her going with anyone else. In fact, I know she didn't." "Very good, that settles that," snapped Jeffson. "I judged from her letters that what you say is true. At the same time, we must know all the facts. It might make a very great difference if there was someone else." And at this point Clyde could not quite make sure whether he was attempting to impress upon him the value of this as an idea or not. But just the same he decided it was not right even to consider it. And yet he was thinking, if only this man could think of a real defense for me. He looked so shrewd. "Well then," went on Jeffson, in the same hard, searching tone, devoid, as Clyde saw it, of sentiment or pity of any kind, "here's something else I want to ask you. In all the time that you knew her, either before you were intimate with her or afterwards, did she ever write you a mean or sarcastic or demanding or threatening letter of any kind?" "No, sir. I can't say that she ever did," replied Clyde. "In fact, I know she didn't." "No, sir. Except for those few last ones, maybe, the very last one. And you never wrote her any, I suppose? No, sir. I never wrote her any letters. Why? Well, she was right there in the factory with me, you see. Besides, at the last there, after she went home, I was afraid to. I see. At the same time, as Clyde now proceeded to point out, and that quite honestly, Roberta could be far from sweet-tempered at times, could in fact be quite determined and even stubborn, and she'd paid no least attention to his plea that her forcing him to marry her now would ruin him socially, as well as in every other way, and that even in the face of his willingness to work along and pay for her support, an attitude which, as he now described it, was what had caused all the trouble, whereas Miss Finchley, and here he introduced an element of reverence and enthusiasm which Jefferson was quick to note, was willing to do everything for him. So you really loved that Miss Finchley very much, then, did you? Yes, sir. And you couldn't care for Roberta any more after you met her? No, I just couldn't. I see, observed Jefferson, solemnly nodding his head, and at the same time meditating on how futile and dangerous even it might be to let the jury know that, and then thinking that possibly it were best to follow the previous suggestion of Belknap's, based on the customary legal proceeding of the time, and claim insanity or a brainstorm brought about by the terrifying position in which he imagined himself to be. But apart from that, he now proceeded, "You say something came over you when you were in the boat out there with her on that last day, that you really didn't know what you were doing at the time that you struck her?" "Yes, sir, that's the truth." And here Clyde went on to explain once more just what his state was at that time. All right, I believe you," replied Jefferson, seemingly believing what Clyde said, but not actually able to conceive it at that. "But you know, of course, that no jury, in the face of all these other circumstances, is going to believe that," he now announced. "There are too many things that'll have to be explained, and that we can't very well explain as things now stand. I don't know about that idea." He now turned and was addressing Belknap. "Those two hats, that bag, unless we're going to plead insanity or something like that, I'm not so sure about all this. Was there ever any insanity in your family that you know of?" he now added, turning to Clyde once more. "No, sir, not that I know of." "No uncle or cousin or grandfather who had fits or strange ideas or anything like that?" "Not that I ever heard of. No, sir." "And your rich relatives down there in Lycurgus, I suppose they'd not like it very much if I were to step up and try to prove anything like that?" "I'm afraid they wouldn't. No, sir," replied Clyde, thinking of Gilbert. "Well, let me see," went on Jefferson after a time. "That makes it rather hard. I don't see, though, that anything else would be as safe." And here he turned once more to Belknap, and began to inquire as to what he thought of suicide as a theory, since Roberta's letters themselves showed a melancholy trend which might easily have led to thoughts of suicide. And could they not say that once out on the lake with Clyde and pleading with him to marry her, and he refusing to do so, she had jumped overboard, and he was too astounded and mentally upset to try to save her? But what about his own story, that the wind had blown his hat off, and in trying to save that he upset the boat, interjected Belknap, and exactly as though Clyde were not present. Well, that's true enough, but couldn't we say that, perhaps, since he was morally responsible for her condition, which in turn had caused her to take her life, he did not want to confess to the truth of her suicide? At this Clyde winced, but neither now troubled to notice him. They talked as though he was not present, or could have no opinion in the matter, a procedure which astonished but by no means moved him to object, since he was feeling so helpless. But the false registrations, the two hats, the suit, his bag, insisted Belknap staccatically, a tone which showed Clyde how serious Belknap considered his predicament to be. "Well, whatever theory we advance, those things will have to be accounted for in some way," replied Jefferson dubiously. "We can't admit the true story of this plotting without an insanity plea, not as I see it, at any rate, and unless we use that, we've got that evidence to deal with whatever we do." He threw up his hands wearily, and as if to say, "I swear I don't know what to do about this." "But," persisted Belknap, "in the face of all that, and his refusal to marry her, after his promises referred to in her letters, Why, it would only react against him, so that public opinion would be more prejudiced against him than ever. No, that won't do, he concluded. We'll have to think of something which will create some sort of sympathy for him. And then once more turning to Clyde, as though there had been no such discussion, and looking at him as much as to say, "You are a problem indeed." And then Jeffson observing, "And oh yes, that suit you dropped in that lake up there near the Cranstons. Describe the spot to me as near as you can where you threw it. How far from the house was it?" He waited until Clyde haltingly attempted to recapture the various details of the hour and the scene as he could recall it. "If I could go up there, I could find it quick enough." "Yes, I know, but they won't let you go up there without Mason being along," he returned, "and maybe not even then. You're in prison now, and you can't be taken out without the state's consent, you see. But we must get that suit." Then, turning to Belknap and lowering his voice, he added, "We want to get it and have it cleaned and submitted as having been sent away to be cleaned by him, not hidden, you see." "Yes, that's so," commented Belknap idly, while Clyde stood listening curiously and a little amazed by this frank program of trickery and deception on his behalf. "And now in regard to that camera that fell in the lake, we have to try and find that too. I think maybe Mason may know about it or suspect that it's there. At any rate, it's very important that we should find it before he does. You think that about where that pole was that day you were up there is where the boat was when it overturned?" "Yes, sir." "Well, we must see if we can get that," he continued, turning to Belknap. "We don't want that turning up in the trial if we can help it, for without that they'll have to be swearing that he struck her with that tripod or something that he didn't, and that's where we may trip 'em up." "Yes, that's true enough," replied Belknap. "And now in regard to the bag that Mason has. That's another thing I haven't seen yet, but I will see it tomorrow. Did you put that suit, as wet as it was, in the bag when you came out of the water?" "No, sir. I wrung it out first, and then I dried it as much as I could, and then I wrapped it up in the paper that we had the lunch in, and then put some dry pine needles underneath in the bag and on top of it." "So there weren't any wet marks in the bag after you took it out, as far as you know?" "No, sir, I don't think so." "But you're not sure?" "Not exactly sure now that you ask me. No, sir." "Well, I'll see for myself tomorrow. And now, as to those marks on her face, you've never admitted to anyone around here or anywhere that you struck her in any way?" "No, sir." "And the mark on the top of her head was made by the boat, just as you said?" "Yes, sir." "But the others you think you might have made with the camera?" "Yes, sir. I suppose they were." "Well, then, this is the way it looks to me," said Jeffson, again turning to Belknap. "I think we can safely say, when the time comes, that those marks were never made by him at all, see? But by the hooks and the poles with which they were scraping around up there when they were trying to find her. We can try it anyhow. And if the hooks and poles didn't do it," he added, a little grimly and dryly, "certainly hauling her body from that lake to that railroad station, and from there to here on the train might have." "Yes, I think Mason would have a hard time proving that they weren't made that way," replied Belknap. "And as for that tripod, well, we'd better exhume the body and make our own measurements, and measure the thickness of the edge of that boat, so that it may not be so easy for Mason to make any use of the tripod now that he has it after all." Mr. Jeffson's eyes were very small and very clear and very blue as he said this. His head, as well as his body, had a thin, ferrety look, and it seemed to Clyde, who had been observing and listening to all this with awe, that this younger man might be the one to aid him. He was so shrewd and practical, so very direct and chill and indifferent, and yet confidence-inspiring, quite like an uncontrollable machine of a kind which generates power. And when at last these two were ready to go, he was sorry, for with them near him, planning and plotting in regard to himself, he felt so much safer, stronger, more hopeful, more certain of being free, maybe at some future date. Chapter 16. The result of all this, however, was that it was finally decided that perhaps the easiest and safest defense that could be made, assuming that the Griffiths family of Lycurgus would submit to it, would be that of insanity or brainstorm, a temporary aberration due to love and an illusion of grandeur aroused in Clyde by Sandra Finchley, and the threatened disruption by Roberta of all his dreams and plans. But after consultation with Catcherman and Dara Brookhart at Lycurgus, and these in turn conferring with Samuel and Gilbert Griffiths, it was determined that this would not do, for to establish insanity or brainstorm would require previous evidence or testimony to the effect that Clyde was of none too sound mind, erratic his whole life long, and with certain specific instances tending to demonstrate how really peculiar he was, relatives, among them the Griffiths of Lycurgus themselves perhaps, coming on to swear to it, a line of evidence which, requiring, as it would, outright lying and perjury on the part of many as well as reflecting on the Griffiths' blood and brain, was sufficient to alienate both Samuel and Gilbert to the extent that they would have none of it, and so Brookhart was compelled to assure Belknap that this line of defense would have to be abandoned. Such being the case, both Belknap and Jeffson were once more compelled to sit down and consider, for any other defense which either could think of now seemed positively hopeless. "I want to tell you one thing," observed the sturdy Jeffson, after thumbing through the letters of both Roberta and Sandra again. "These letters of this Alden girl are the toughest things we're going to have to face. They're likely to make any jury cry if they're read right, and then to introduce those letters from that other girl on top of these would be fatal. It will be better, I think, if we do not mention hers at all unless he does. It will only make it look as though he'd killed that Alden girl to get rid of her. Mason couldn't want anything better, as I see it." And with this Belknap agreed most heartily. At the same time, some plan must be devised immediately, and so out of these various conferences it was finally deduced by Jeffson, who saw a great opportunity for himself in this matter, that the safest possible defense that could be made, and one to which Clyde's own suspicions and most peculiar actions would most exactly fit, would be that he had never contemplated murder. On the contrary, being a moral if not a physical coward, as his own story seemed to suggest, and in terror of being exposed and driven out of Lycurgus and of the heart of Sandra, and never as yet having told Roberta of Sandra, and thinking that knowledge of this great love for her, Sandra, might influence Roberta to wish to be rid of him, he'd hastily, and without any worse plan in mind, decided to persuade Roberta to accompany him to any nearby resort, but not especially Grass Lake or Big Bittern, in order to tell her all this and so win his freedom, yet not without offering to pay her expenses as nearly as he could during her very trying period. "Oh, well and good," commented Belknap, "but that involves his refusing to marry her, doesn't it? And what jury is going to sympathize with him for that, or believe that he didn't want to kill her?" Wait a minute, replied Jeffson a little testily. "So far it does, sure, but you haven't heard me to the end yet. I said I had a plan." "All right, then. What is it?" replied Belknap, most interested. "Well, I'll tell you. My plan's this: to leave all the facts just as they are and just as he tells them, and just as Mason has discussed them so far, except, of course, his striking her, and then explain them, the letters, the wounds, the bag, the 2 hats, everything. Not deny them in any way." And here he paused, and ran his long, thin, freckled hands eagerly through his light hair, and looked across the grass of the public square to the jail where Clyde was, then toward Belknap again. "Oh, very good, but how?" queried Belknap. "There's no other way, I tell you," went on Jeffson, quite to himself and ignoring his senior, "and I think this will do it." End of cassette number 4, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 4, side 2 of An American Tragedy, Part 2. Jeffson turned to look out the window again, and began as though talking to someone outside. "He goes up there, you see, because he's frightened, and because he has to do something or be exposed. And he signs those registers just as he did, because he's afraid to have it known by anybody down there in Lycurgus that he's up there. And he has this plan about confessing to her about this other girl. But," and now he paused and looked fixedly at Belknap, "and this is the keystone of the whole thing. If this won't hold water, then down we go. Listen. He goes up there with her frightened, and not to marry her or to kill her, but to argue with her to go away. But once up there and he sees how sick she is and tired and sad, well, you know how much she still loves him, and he spends 2 nights with her, see?" "Yes, I see," interrupted Belknap curiously, but not quite so dubiously now. "And that might explain those nights." "Might? Would," replied Jefferson, slyly and calmly, his harebell eyes showing only cold, eager, practical logic, no trace of emotion or even sympathy of any kind, really. Well, while he's up there with her under those conditions, so close to her again, you see, and his facial expression never altered so much as by a line, he experiences a change of heart, you get me? He's sorry for her. He's ashamed of himself, his sin against her. That ought to appeal to these fellows around here, these religious and moral people, oughtn't it?" "It might," quietly interpolated Belknap, who by now was very much interested and a little hopeful. "He sees that he's done her wrong," continued Jefferson, intent, like a spider spinning a web, on his own plan. "And in spite of all his affection for this other girl, he's now ready to do the right thing by this Alden girl, you see, because he's sorry and ashamed of himself. That takes the black look off his plotting to kill her while spending those 2 nights in Utica and Grass Lake with her." "He still loves the other girl, though," interjected Belknap. "Well, sure. He likes her at any rate, has been fascinated by that life down there and sort of taken out of himself, made over into a different person. But now he's ready to marry Roberta. In case, after telling her all about this other girl and his love for her, she still wants him to." "I see. But how about the boat now, and that bag, and his going up to this Finchley girl's place afterwards?" Just a minute. I'll tell you about that," continued Jefferson, his blue eyes boring into space like a powerful electric ray. "Of course he goes out in the boat with her, and of course he takes that bag, and of course he signs those registers falsely, and walks away through those woods to that other girl after Roberta is drowned. But why? Why? Do you want to know why? I'll tell you. He felt sorry for her, see, and he wanted to marry her, or at least he wanted to do the right thing by her at the very last there. Not before, remember, but after he'd spent a night with her in Utica and another one in Grass Lake. But once she was drowned, and accidentally, of course, as he says, there was his love for that other girl. He hadn't ceased loving her, even though he was willing to sacrifice her in order to do the right thing by Roberta, see?" "I see. And how are they going to prove that he didn't experience a change of heart if he says he did and sticks to it?" "I see. But he'll have to make it a mighty convincing story," added Belknap, a little heavily. "And how about those 2 hats? They're going to have to be explained. Well, I'm coming to those now. The one he had was a little soiled, and so he decided to buy another. As for that story he told Mason about wearing a cap, well, he was frightened and lied, because he thought he would have to get out of it. Now, of course, before he goes to that other girl afterwards, while Roberta is still alive, I mean, there's his relationship with the other girl, what he intends to do about her. He's talking to Roberta now, you see," he continued, "and that has to be disposed of in some way. But as I see it, that's easy, for of course after he experiences a change of heart and wants to do the right thing by Roberta, all he has to do is to write that other girl or go to her and tell her about the wrong he's done Roberta. Yes, for as I see it now, she can't be kept out of the case entirely after all. We'll have to ring her in, I'm afraid." "All right, then we have to," said Belknap, "because you see, if Roberta still feels that he ought to marry her, he'll go first and tell that Finchley girl that he can't marry her, that he's going away. That is, if Roberta doesn't object to his leaving her that long, don't you see?" "Yes." "If she does, he'll marry her, either at 3 Mile Bay or some other place." "Yes." "But you don't want to forget that while she's still alive, he's puzzled and distressed. And it's only after that second night at Grass Lake that he begins to see how wrong all his actions have been, you understand. Something happens. Maybe she cries or talks about wanting to die, like she does in those letters." "Yes." "And so he wants a quiet place where they can sit down in peace and talk, where no one else will see or hear them." Yes, go on." "Well, he thinks a Big Bittern. He's been up there once before, or they're near there then, and just below there, 12 miles, is 3 Mile Bay, where if they decide to marry, they can." "I see." "If not, if she doesn't want to marry him after his full confession, He can row her back to the inn, can't he? And he or she can stay there or go on. Yes, yes. In the meantime, not to have any delay or be compelled to hang about that inn. It's rather expensive, you know, and he hasn't any too much money. He takes that lunch in his bag, also his camera, because he wants to take some pictures. For if Mason should turn up with that camera, it's got to be explained, and it will be better explained by us than it will be by him, won't it? I see, exclaimed Belknap, intensely interested by now, and actually smiling and beginning to rub his hands. So they go out on the lake, yes, and they row around, yes, and finally after lunch on shore some pictures taken, yes. He decides to tell her just how things stand with him. He's ready, willing. I get you. Only just before doing that, he wants to take one or two more pictures of her there in the boat, just offshore. Yes. And then he'll tell her, see? Yes. And so they go out in the boat again for a little row, just as he did, see? Yes. But because they intend to go ashore again for some flowers, he's left the bag there, see? That explains the bag. Yes. But before taking any more pictures there, in the boat on the water, he begins to tell her about his love for this other girl, that if she wants him to now he'll marry her, and then write this sombre letter, or if she feels she doesn't want to marry him with him loving this other girl. Yes, go on, interrupted Belknap eagerly. Well, continued Jefferson, he'll do his best to take care of her and support her out of the money he'll have after he marries the rich girl. Yes. Well, she wants him to marry her and drop this Miss Finchley. I see. And he agrees? Sure. Also, she's so grateful that in her excitement or gratitude, she jumps up to come court him, you see? Yes. And the boat rocks a little, and he jumps up to help her because he's afraid she's going to fall, see? Yes, I see. Well, now, if we wanted to, we could have him have that camera of his in his hand or not, just as you think fit. Yes, I see what you're driving at. Well, whether he keeps it in his hand or doesn't, there's some misstep on his part or hers, just as he says, or just the motion of the two bodies causes the boat to go over, and he strikes her, or not, just as you think fit, but accidentally, of course. Yes, I see, and I'll be damned, exclaimed Belknap. Fine, Reuben, excellent, wonderful, really. And the boat strikes her, too, as well as him a little, see? Went on Jefferson, paying no attention to this outburst, so interested was he in his own plot, and makes him a little dizzy, too. I see. And he hears her cries and sees her, but he's a little stunned himself, see? And by the time he's ready to do something, she's gone, concluded Belknap quietly. Drowned. I get you. And then, because of all those other suspicious circumstances and false registrations, and because now she's gone, and he can't do anything more for her anyhow, her relatives might not want to know her condition, you know. I see. He slips away frightened, a moral coward, just as we'll have to contend from the first, anxious to stand well with his uncle and not lose his place in this world. Doesn't that explain it? About as well as anything could explain it, Reuben, I think. In fact, I think it's a plausible explanation, and I congratulate you. I don't see how anyone could hope to find a better. If that doesn't get him off, or bring about a disagreement, at least we might get him off with, well, say 20 years, don't you think? And very much cheered, he got up, and after eyeing his long, thin associate admiringly, added, Fine, while Jefferson, his blue eyes for all the world like windless still pools, looked steadily back. But of course you know what that means, Jefferson now added, calmly and softly. That we have to put him on the witness stand. Surely, surely. I see that well enough, but it's his only chance. And he won't strike people as a very steady or convincing fellow, I'm afraid, too nervous and emotional. Yes, I know all that, replied Belknap quickly. He's easily rattled, and Mason will go after him like a wild bull. But we'll have to coach him as to all this, drill him, make him understand that it's his only chance, that his very life depends on it. Drill him for months. If he fails, then he's gone. If only we could do something to give him courage, teach him to act it out. Jefferson's eyes seemed to be gazing directly before him at the very courtroom scene in which Clyde, on the stand, would have Mason before him. And then picking up Roberta's letters, copies of them furnished by Mason, and looking at them, he concluded, if it only weren't for these here. He weighed them up and down in his hand. Christ, he finally concluded darkly, what a case! But we're not licked yet, not by a darn sight. Why, we haven't begun to fight yet, and we'll get a lot of publicity anyhow. By the way, he added, I'm having a fellow I know down near Big Bittern dredge for that camera tonight. Wish me luck. Do I? Was all Belknap replied. Chapter 17. The struggle and excitement of a great murder trial. Belknap and Jeffson, after consulting with Brookhart and Catcherman, learning that they considered Jeffson's plan perhaps the only way, but with as little reference to the Griffiths as possible, and then at once Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson issuing preliminary statements framed in such a manner as to show their faith in Clyde, presenting him as being in reality a much maligned and entirely misunderstood youth, whose intentions and actions toward Miss Alden were as different from those set forth by Mason as white from black, and intimating that the undue haste of the district attorney in seeking a special term of the Supreme Court might possibly have a political rather than a purely legal meaning. Else why the hurry, especially in the face of an approaching county election? Could there be any plan to use the results of such a trial as this to further any particular person's or group of persons' political ambitions? Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson begged to hope not. But regardless of such plans or the prejudices or the political aspirations of any particular person or group, the defense in this instance did not propose to permit a boy as innocent as Clyde, trapped by circumstances, as counsel for the defense would be prepared to show, to be railroaded to the electric chair merely to achieve a victory for the Republican Party in November. Furthermore, to combat these strange and yet false circumstances, the defense would require a considerable period of time to prepare its case. Therefore, it would be necessary for them to file a formal protest at Albany against the district attorney's request to the governor for a special term of the Supreme Court. There was no need for the same, since the regular term for the trial of such cases would fall in January, and the preparation of their case would require that much time. But while this strong, if rather belated reply was listened to with proper gravity by the representatives of the various newspapers, Mason vigorously pooh-poohed this windy assertion of political plotting, as well as the talk of Clyde's innocence. What reason have I, a representative of all the people of this county, to railroad this man anywhere or make one single charge against him, unless the charges make themselves? Doesn't the evidence itself show that he did kill this girl? And has he ever said or done one thing to clear up any of the suspicious circumstances? No. Silence or lies. And until these circumstances are disproved by these very able gentlemen, I'm going right ahead. I have all the evidence necessary to convict this young criminal now, and to delay it until January, when I shall be out of office, as they know, and when a new man will have to go over all this evidence with which I have familiarized myself, is to entail great expense to the county. For all the witnesses I've gotten together are right here now, easy to bring into Bridgeburg without any great expense to the county. But where will they be next January or February, especially after the defense has done its best to scatter them? No, sir, I will not agree to it. But if within 10 days or 2 weeks from now even, they can bring me something that will so much as make it look as though even some of the charges I've made are not true, I'll be perfectly willing to go before the presiding judge with them, and if they can show him any evidence they have or hope to have, or that there are any distant known witnesses to be secured who can help prove this fellow's innocence, why then well and good. I'll be willing to ask the judge to grant them as much time as he may see fit, even if it throws the trial over until I'm out of office. But if the trial comes up while I'm here, as I honestly hope it will, I'll prosecute it to the best of my ability, not because I'm looking for an office of any kind, but because I'm now the district attorney, and it's my duty to do so. And as for my being in politics, well, Mr. Belknap is in politics, isn't he? He ran against me the last time, and I hear he desires to run again. Accordingly, he proceeded to Albany further to impress upon the governor the very great need of an immediate special term of the court so that Clyde might be indicted. And the governor, hearing the personal arguments of both Mason and Belknap, decided in favor of Mason, on the ground that the granting of a special term did not militate against any necessary delay of the trial of the case, since nothing which the defense as yet had to offer seemed to indicate that the calling of a special term was likely in any way to prevent it from obtaining as much time wherein to try the case as needed. Besides, it would be the business of the Supreme Court justice appointed to consider such arguments, not himself, and accordingly a special term of the Supreme Court was ordered, with one Justice Frederick Oberwalzer of the 11th Judicial District designated to preside, and when Mason appeared before him with the request that he fix the date of the special grand jury by which Clyde might be indicted, this was set for August 5th. And then, that body sitting, it was no least trouble for Mason to have Clyde indicted. And thereafter the best that Belknap and Jeffson could do was to appear before Oberwalzer, a Democrat, who owed his appointment to a previous governor, to argue for a change of venue, on the ground that by no possible stretch of the imagination could any 12 men residing in Cataraqui County be found who, owing to the public and private statements of Mason, were not already vitally opposed to Clyde and so convinced of his guilt that before ever such a jury could be addressed by a defense, he would be convicted. "But where are you going, then?" inquired Justice Oberwalzer, who was impartial enough. "The same material has been published everywhere." "But, Your Honor, this crime which the district attorney here has been so busy in magnifying—" A long and heated objection on the part of Mason. "But we contend just the same," continued Belknap, "that the public has been unduly stirred and deluded. You can't get 12 men now who will try this man fairly." "What nonsense!" exclaimed Mason angrily. "Mere twaddle! Why, the newspapers themselves have gathered and published more evidence than I have. It's the publicly discovered facts in this case that have aroused prejudice, if any has been aroused. But no more than would be aroused anywhere, I maintain. Besides, if this case is to be transferred to a distant county when the majority of the witnesses are right here, this county is going to be saddled with an enormous expense, which it cannot afford and which the facts do not warrant." Justice Oberwalzer was of a sober and moral turn, a slow and meticulous man, inclined to favor conservative procedure in all things, was inclined to agree. And after 5 days, in which he did not more than muse idly upon the matter, he decided to deny the motion. If he were wrong, there was the appellate division to which the defense could resort. As for stays, having fixed the date of the trial for October 15th, ample time, as he judged, for the defense to prepare its case, he adjourned for the remainder of the summer to his cottage on Blue Mountain Lake, where both the prosecution and the defense, should any knotty or locally insoluble legal complication arise, would be able to find him and have his personal attention. But with the entry of the Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson into the case, Mason found it advisable to redouble his efforts to make positive, in so far as it were possible, the conviction of Clyde. He feared the young Jeffson as much as he did Belknap, and for that reason, taking with him Burton Burley and Earl Newcomb, he now revisited Lycurgus, where, among other things, he was able to discover 1. Where Clyde had purchased the camera, 2. That 3 days before his departure for Big Bittern, he had said to Mrs. Peyton that he was thinking of taking his camera with him, and that he must get some films for it. 3. That there was a haberdasher by the name of Orrin Short, who'd known Clyde well, and that but 4 months before Clyde had applied to him for advice in connection with a factory hand's pregnant wife. Also, and this in great confidence to Burton Burley, who had unearthed him, that he recommended to Clyde a certain Dr. Glenn, near Gloversville. 4. Dr. Glenn himself being sought and pictures of Clyde and Roberta being submitted, he was able to identify Roberta, although not Clyde, and to describe the state of mind in which he had approached him, as well as the story she told, a story which in no way incriminated Clyde or herself, and which therefore Mason decided might best be ignored for the present anyhow. And 5. Via these same enthusiastic efforts, there rose to the surface the particular hat salesman in Utica who'd sold Clyde the hat. For Burton Burley being interviewed while in Utica, and his picture published along with one of Clyde, this salesman chanced to see it, and recalling him at once made haste to communicate with Mason, with the result that his testimony, properly typewritten and sworn to, was carried away by Mason. And in addition, the country girl who'd been on the steamer Cygnus, and who'd noticed Clyde, wrote Mason that she remembered him wearing a straw hat, also as leaving the boat at Sharon, a bit of evidence which most fully confirmed that of the captain of the boat, and caused Mason to feel that Providence or fate was working with him. And last but most important of all to him, there came a communication from a woman residing in Bedford, Pennsylvania, who announced that during the week of July 3rd to 10th, she and her husband had been camping on the east shore of Big Bittern, near the southern end of the lake. And while rowing on the lake on the afternoon of July 8th at about 6 o'clock, she'd heard a cry which sounded like that of a woman or a girl in distress, a plaintive, mournful cry. It was very faint, and it seemed to come from beyond the island, which was to the south and west of the bay in which they were fishing. Mason now proposed to remain absolutely silent regarding this information, and that about the camera and films and the data regarding Clyde's offense in Kansas City, until nearer the day of trial, or during the trial itself, when it would be impossible for the defense to attempt either to refute or ameliorate it in any way. As for Belknap and Jeffson, apart from drilling Clyde in the matter of his general denial, based on his change of heart once he'd arrived at Grass Lake, and the explanation of the 2 hats in the bag, they could not see that there was much to do. True, there was a suit thrown in Fourth Lake near the Cranstons, but after much trolling on the part of a seemingly casual fisherman, that was brought up, cleaned and pressed, and now hung in a locked closet in the Belknap and Jeffson offices. Also there was the camera at Big Bittern, dived for but never found by them, a circumstance which led Jeffson to conclude that Mason must have it, and so caused him to decide that he would refer to it at the earliest possible opportunity at the trial. But as for Clyde striking her with it, even accidentally, well, it was decided at that time at least to contend that he had not, although after exhuming Roberta's body at Bilt's it had been found that the marks on her face, even at this date, did correspond in some degree to the size and shape of the camera. For in the first place they were exceedingly dubious of Clyde as a witness. Would he or would he not, in telling of how it all happened, be sufficiently direct or forceful and sincere to convince any jury that he had so struck her without intending to strike her? For on that, marks or no marks, would depend whether the jury was going to believe him. And if it did not believe that he struck her accidentally, then a verdict of guilty, of course. And so they prepared to await the coming of the trial, only working betimes and insofar as they dared, to obtain testimony or evidence as to Clyde's previous good character, but being blocked to a degree by the fact that in Lycurgus, while pretending to be a model youth outwardly, he had privately been conducting himself otherwise, and that in Kansas City his first commercial efforts had resulted in such a scandal. However, one of the most difficult matters in connection with Clyde and his incarceration here, as Belknap and Jeffson as well as the prosecution saw it, was the fact that thus far not one single member of his own or his uncle's family had come forward to champion him. And to no one save Belknap and Jeffson had he admitted where his parents were. Yet would it not be necessary, as both Belknap and Jeffson argued from time to time, if any case at all were to be made out for him, to have his mother or father, or at least a sister or a brother, come forward to say a good word for him? Otherwise Clyde might appear to be a pariah, one who had been from the first a drifter and a waster, and was now purposely being avoided by all who knew him. For this reason, at their conference with Dara Brookhart, they had inquired after Clyde's parents, and had learned that insofar as the Griffiths of Lycurgus were concerned, there lay a deep objection to bringing on any member of this western branch of the family. There was, as he explained, a great social gap between them, which it would not please the Lycurgus Griffiths to have exploited here. Besides, who could say but that once Clyde's parents were notified or discovered by the yellow press, they might not lend themselves to exploitation? Both Samuel and Gilbert Griffiths, as Brookhart now informed Belknap, had suggested that it was best if Clyde did not object to keep his immediate relatives in the background. In fact, on this, in some measure at least, was likely to depend the extent of their financial aid to Clyde. Clyde was in accord with this wish of the Griffiths, although no one who talked with him sufficiently or heard him express how sorry he was, on his mother's account, that all this had happened, could doubt the quality of the blood and emotional tie that held him and his mother together. The complete truth was that his present attitude toward her was a mixture of fear and shame, because of the manner in which he was likely to view his predicament, his moral if not his social failure. Would she be willing to believe the story prepared by Belknap and Jeffson as to his change of heart? But even apart from that, to have her come here now and look at him through these bars when he was so disgraced, to be compelled to face her and talk to her day after day, her clear, inquiring, tortured eyes, her doubt as to his innocence, since he could feel that even Belknap and Jeffson, in spite of all their plans for him, were still a little dubious as to that unintentional blow of his. They did not really believe it, and they might tell her that. And would his religious, God-fearing, crime-abhorring mother be more credulous than they? Being asked again what he thought ought to be done about his parents, he replied that he did not believe he could face his mother yet. It would do no good and would only torture both. And, fortunately, as he saw it, apparently no word of all that had befallen him had yet reached his parents in Denver. Because of their peculiar religious and moral beliefs, all copies of worldly and degenerate daily papers were consistently excluded from their home and mission, and the Lycurgus Griffiths had had no desire to inform them. Yet one night, at about the time that Belknap and Jeffson were most seriously debating the absence of his parents and what, if anything, should be done about it, Esther, who some time after Clyde had arrived in Lycurgus, had married and was living in the southeast portion of Denver, chanced to read the Rocky Mountain News, and this just subsequent to Clyde's indictment by the grand jury at Bridgeburg. Boy slayer of working girl indicted. Bridgeburg, New York, August 6. A special grand jury appointed by Governor Stouterback of the state to sit in the case of Clyde Griffiths, the nephew of the wealthy collar manufacturer of the same name of Lycurgus, New York, recently charged with the killing of Miss Roberta Alden of Bouts, New York, at Big Bittern Lake in the Adirondacks on July 8th last, today returned an indictment charging murder in the first degree. Subsequent to the indictment, Griffiths, who in spite of almost overwhelming evidence, has persisted in asserting that the alleged crime was an accident, and who, accompanied by his counsel, Alvin Belknap and Reuben Jeffson of this city, was arraigned before Supreme Court Justice Oberwalzer, pleaded not guilty. He was remanded for trial, which was set for October 15th. Young Griffiths was only 22 years of age, and up to the day of his arrest a respected member of Lycurgus Smart Society, is alleged to have stunned and then drowned his working-girl sweetheart, whom he'd wronged, and then planned to desert in favor of a richer girl. The lawyers in this case have been retained by his wealthy uncle of Lycurgus, who has hitherto remained aloof. But apart from this, it is locally asserted no relative has come forward to aid in his defense. Esther forthwith made a hurried departure for her mother's home. Despite the directness and clarity of this, she was not willing to believe it was Clyde. Still, there was the damning force of geography and names, the rich Lycurgus Griffiths, the absence of his own relatives. As quickly as the local streetcar would carry her, she now presented herself at the combined lodging-house and mission known as the Star of Hope in Bildwell Street, which was scarcely better than that formerly maintained in Kansas City. But while it provided a number of rooms for wayfarers at 25 cents a night, and was supposed to be self-supporting, it entailed much work with hardly any more profit. Besides, by now, both Frank and Julia, who long before this had become irked by the drab world in which they found themselves, had earnestly sought to free themselves of it, leaving the burden of the mission work on their father and mother. Julia, now 19, was cashiering for a local downtown restaurant, and Frank, nearing 17, had but recently found work at a fruit and vegetable commission house. In fact, the only child about the place by day was little Russell, the illegitimate son of Esther, now between 3 and 4 years of age, and most reservedly fictionalized by his grandparents as an orphan whom they'd adopted in Kansas City. He was a dark-haired child, in some ways resembling Clyde, who even at this early age, as Clyde had been before him, was being instructed in those fundamental verities which had irritated Clyde in his own childhood. At the time that Esther, now a decidedly subdued and reserved wife, entered, Mrs. Griffiths was busy sweeping and dusting and making up beds. But on sight of her daughter at this unusual hour approaching, and with blanched cheeks signaling her to come inside the door of a vacant room, Mrs. Griffiths, who because of years of difficulties of various kinds, was more or less accustomed to scenes such as this, now paused in wonder, the swiftly beclouding mist of apprehension shining in her eyes. What new misery or ill was this? for decidedly Esther's weak gray eyes and manner indicated distress, and in her hand was folded a paper, which she opened, and after giving her mother a most solicitous look, pointed to the item toward which Mrs. Griffiths now directed her look. But what was this? Boy slayer of working girl sweetheart indicted? Charged with the killing of Miss Roberta Alden at Big Bittern Lake in the Adirondacks on July 8 last. Returned indictment charging murder in the first degree. In spite of almost overwhelming circumstantial evidence, pleaded not guilty. Remanded for trial set for October 15th. Stunned and drowned his working girl sweetheart. No relative has come forward. It was thus that her eye and her mind automatically selected the most essential lines, and then as swiftly going over them again. Clyde Griffiths, nephew of the wealthy collar manufacturer of Lycurgus, New York. Clyde, her son, and only recently, but no, over a month ago. And they'd been worrying a little as to that, she and Asa, because he'd not. July 8th, and it was now August 11th. Then yes, but not her son. Impossible. Clyde the murderer of a girl who was his sweetheart. But he was not like that. He had written to her how he was getting along, the head of a large department with a future, but of no girl. But now, and yet that other little girl there in Kansas City. Merciful God! And the Griffiths of Lycurgus, her husband's brother, knowing of this and not writing. Ashamed, disgusted, no doubt, indifferent. But no, he'd hired 2 lawyers. Yet the horror. Asa, her other children, what the papers would say, this mission. They would have to give it up and go somewhere else again. Yet was he guilty or not guilty? She must know that before judging or thinking. This paper said he'd pleaded not guilty. Oh, that wretched, worldly, showy hotel in Kansas City, those other bad boys, those 2 years in which he wandered here and there, not writing, passing as Harry Tennant, doing what, learning what? She paused, full of that intense misery and terror which no faith in the revealed and comforting verities of God and mercy and salvation, which he was always proclaiming, could for the moment fend against. Her boy, her Clyde, in jail, accused of murder. She must wire. She must write. She must go, maybe. But how to get the money? What to do when she got there? How to get the courage, the faith to endure it? Yet again neither Asa nor Frank nor Julia must know. Asa with his protesting and yet somehow careworn faith, his weak eyes and weakening body. And must Frank and Julia, now just starting out in life, be saddled with this, marked thus? Merciful God! Would her troubles never end? She turned, her big work-worn hands trembling slightly, shaking the paper she held, while Esther, who sympathized greatly with her mother these days because of all she'd been compelled to endure, stood by. She looked so tired at times, and now to be racked by this. Yet as she knew her mother was the strongest in the family, so erect, so square-shouldered, defiant, a veritable soul pilot in her cross-grained, uniformed way. "Mamma, I just can't believe it can be Clyde," was all Esther could say now. "It just can't be, can it?" But Mrs. Griffiths merely continued to stare at that ominous headline, then swiftly ran her gray-blue eyes over the room. Her broad face was blanched and dignified by an enormous strain and an enormous pain. Her erring, misguided, no doubt unfortunate son, with all his wild dreams of getting on and up, was in danger of death, of being electrocuted for a crime, for murder. He'd killed someone, a poor working girl, the paper said. "Shh," she whispered, putting one finger to her own lips as a sign. "He," indicating Asa, "must not know yet, anyhow. We must wire first, all right. You can have the answers come to you, maybe. I will give you the money. But I must sit down somewhere now for a minute. I feel a little weak. I'll sit here. Let me have the Bible." On the small dresser was a Gideon Bible, which, sitting on the edge of the commonplace iron bed, she now opened instinctively at Psalms 3 and 4. "Lord, how are they increased the trouble? Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness." And then reading on silently, even placidly apparently, through 6, 8, 10, 13, 23, 91, while Esther stood by in silent amazement and misery. "Oh, Mamma, I just can't believe it. Oh, this is too terrible." But Mrs. Griffiths read on. It was as if, and in spite of all this, she had been able to retreat into some still, silent place, where, for the time being at least, no evil human ill could reach her. Then at last, quite calmly closing the book, and rising, she went on, "Now, we must think out what to say, and who to send that telegram to. I mean to Clyde, of course, at that place, wherever it is. Bridgeburg," she added, looking at the paper, and then interpolating from the Bible, "Thy terrible things in righteousness will thou answer us, O God." Or maybe those two lawyers, their names are there. I'm afraid to wire Asa's brother for fear he'll wire back to him. Then, "Thou art my bulwark and my strength. In thee will I trust." But I suppose they would give it to him if we sent it care of that judge or those lawyers, don't you think? But it would be better if we could send it to him direct, I suppose. He leadeth me by the still waters. Just say that I've read about him and still have faith and love for him. But he's to tell me the truth and what to do. If he needs money, we'll have to see what we can do, I suppose. He restoreth my soul." And then, despite her sudden peace of the moment, she once more began wringing her large rough hands. "Oh, it can't be true. Oh, dear, no. After all, he is my son. We all love him and have faith. We must say that. God will deliver him. Watch and pray, have faith. Under his wings shalt thou trust." She was so beside herself that she scarcely knew what she was saying. And Esther at her side was saying, "Yes, Mamma. Oh, of course. Yes, I will. I know he'll get it all right." But she, too, was saying to herself, "My God! My God! What could be worse than this? To be accused of murder. But of course it can't be true. It can't be true. If he should hear." She was thinking of her husband. And after Russell, too, and Clyde's trouble there in Kansas City. Poor Mamma. She has so much trouble. Together, after a time, and avoiding Asa, who was in an adjoining room, helping with the cleaning, the two made their way to the general mission room below, where was silence and many placards which proclaimed the charity, the wisdom, and the sustaining righteousness of God. Chapter 18. The telegram, worded in the spirit just described, was forthwith dispatched, care of Belknap and Jeffson, who immediately counseled Clyde what to reply, that all was well with him, that he had the best of advice and would need no financial aid, also that until his lawyers advised it, it would be best if no member of the family troubled to appear, since everything that could possibly be done to aid him was already being done. At the same time they wrote Mrs. Griffiths, assuring her of their interest in Clyde, and advising her to let matters rest as they were for the present, despite the fact that the Griffiths were thus restrained from appearing in the East. Neither Belknap nor Jeffson were averse to some news of the existence, whereabouts, faith, and sympathy of Clyde's most immediate relatives creeping into the newspapers, since the latter was so persistent in referring to his isolation. And in this connection they were aided by the fact that his mother's telegram, on being received in Bridgeburg, was at once read by individuals who were particularly interested in the case, and by them whispered to the public and the press, with the result that in Denver the family was at once sought out and interviewed. And shortly after there was circulated in all the papers east and west a more or less complete account of the present state of Clyde's family, the nature of the mission conducted by them, as well as their narrow and highly individualistic religious beliefs and actions, even the statement that often in his early youth Clyde had been taken into the streets to sing and pray, a revelation which shocked Lycurgus and Twelfth Lake society about as much as it did him. At the same time, Mrs. Griffiths, being an honest woman and wholeheartedly sincere in her faith and in the good of her work, did not hesitate to relate to reporter after reporter who called all the details of the missionary work of her husband and herself in Denver and elsewhere, also that neither Clyde nor any of the other children had ever enjoyed the opportunities that come to most. However, her boy, whatever the present charge might be, was not innately bad, and she could not believe that he was guilty of any such crime. It was all an unfortunate and accidental combination of circumstances, which he would explain at the trial. However, whatever foolish thing he might have done, It was all to be attributed to an unfortunate accident which broke up the mission work in Kansas City a few years before, and compelled the removal of the family from there to Denver, leaving Clyde to make his way alone. And it was because of advice from her that he'd written her husband's rich brother, Lycurgus, which led to his going there, a series of statements which caused Clyde in his cell to tingle with a kind of prideful misery and resentment, and forced him to write his mother and complain. Why need she always talk so much about the past and the work that she and his father were connected with, when she knew that he never liked it and resented going on the streets? Many people didn't see it as she and his father did, particularly his uncle and cousin and all those rich people he'd come to know, and who were able to make their way in so different and much more brilliant fashion. And now, as he said to himself, Sandra would most certainly read this, all that he'd hoped to conceal. Yet even in the face of all this, because of so much sincerity and force in his mother, he could not help but think of her with affection and respect, and because of her sure and unfailing love for him, with emotion. For in answer to his letter she wrote that she was sorry if she'd hurt his feelings, or injured him in any way. But must not the truth be shown always? The ways of God were for the best, and surely no harm could spring from service in his cause. He must not ask her to lie, but if he said the word, she would so gladly attempt to raise the necessary money and come to his aid, sit in his cell and plan with him, holding his hands. But as Clyde so well knew and thought at this time, and which caused him to decide that she must not come yet, demanding of him the truth, with those clear, steady blue eyes of hers looking into his own, he could not stand that now. For frowning directly before him, like a huge and basalt headland above a troubled and angry sea, was the trial itself, with all that it implied. The fierce assault of Mason, which he could only confront, for the most part, with the lies framed for him by Jeffson and Belknap. For although he was constantly seeking to salve his conscience with the thought that at the last moment he had not had the courage to strike Roberta, nevertheless this other story was so terribly difficult for him to present and defend, a fact which both Belknap and Jeffson realized, and which caused the latter to appear most frequently at Clyde's cell door with the greeting, "Well, how's tricks today?" The peculiarly rusty and disheveled and indifferently tailored character of Jeffson's suits, the worn and disarranged effect of his dark brown soft hat pulled low over his eyes, his long, bony, knotty hands, suggesting somehow an enormous tensile strength, and the hard, small blue eyes, filled with a shrewd, determined cunning and courage, with which he was seeking to inoculate Clyde, and which somehow did inoculate him. Any more preachers around today? Any more country girls or Mason's boys? For during this time, because of the enormous interest aroused by the pitiable death of Roberta, as well as the evidence of her rich and beautiful rival, Clyde was being visited by every type of shallow crime or sex-curious country bumpkin, lawyer, doctor, merchant, yokel evangelist, or minister, all friends or acquaintances of one or another of the officials of the city, and who, standing before his cell door betimes, and at the most unexpected moments, and after surveying him with curious or resentful or horrified eyes, asked such questions as, "D'ye pray, brother? D'ye get right down on your knees and pray?" Clyde was reminded of his mother and father at such times. Had he made his peace with God? Did he actually deny that he'd killed Roberta Alden? In the case of 3 country girls, would you mind telling us the name of the girl you're supposed to be in love with and where she is now? We won't tell anyone. Will she appear at the trial? Questions which Clyde could do no more than ignore, or if not answer as equivocally or evasively or indifferently as possible. For although he was inclined to resent them, still was he not being constantly instructed by both Belknap and Jeffson that for the good of his own cause he must try to appear genial and civil and optimistic? Then there came also newspaper men or women, accompanied by artists or photographers, to interview and make studies of him. But with these, for the most part, and on the advice of Belknap and Jeffson, he refused to communicate or said only what he was told to say. "You can talk all you want," suggested Jeffson genially, "so long as you don't say anything. And the stiff upper lip, you know, and the smile that won't come off, see? Not failing to go over that list, are you?" He provided Clyde with a long list of possible questions, which no doubt would be asked him on the stand, and which he was to answer according to answers typewritten beneath them, or to suggest something better. They all related to the trip to Big Bittern, his reason for the extra hat, his change of heart, why, when, where. That's your litany, you know. And then he might light a cigarette without ever offering one to Clyde, since for the sake of a reputation for sobriety he was not to smoke here. And for a time after each visit, Clyde finding himself believing that he could and would do exactly as Jefferson had said, walk briskly and smartly into court, bear up against everyone, every eye, even that of Mason himself, forget that he was afraid of him, even when on the witness stand, forget all the terror of those many facts in Mason's possession, which he was to explain with this list of answers, forget Roberta and her last cry, and all the heartache and misery that went with the loss of Sandra and her bright world. Yet with the night having once more fallen, or the day dragging on, with only the lean and bearded crowd, or the sly and evasive Cecil, or both, hanging about, or coming to the door to say howdy, or to discuss something that had occurred in town, or to play chess or checkers, Clyde growing more and more moody and deciding, maybe, that there was no real hope for him after all. For how alone he was, except for his attorneys and mother and brother and sisters. Never a word from Sandra, of course, for along with her recovery to some extent from her original shock and horror, she was now thinking somewhat differently of him. That after all it was for love of her, perhaps, that he'd slain Roberta and made himself the pariah and victim that he now was. Yet because of the immense prejudice and horror expressed by the world, she was by no means able to think of venturing to send him a word. Was he not a murderer? And in addition, that miserable Western family of his, pictured as street preachers, and he too, or as a singing and praying boy from a mission, yet occasionally returning in thought, and this quite in spite of herself, to his eager, unreasoning, and seemingly consuming enthusiasm for her. How deeply he must have cared to venture upon so deadly a deed, and hence wondering whether at some time, once this case was less violently before the public eye, it might not be possible to communicate with him in some guarded and unsigned way, just to let him know, perhaps, that because of his great love for her, she desired him to know that he was not entirely forgotten. This book is continued on cassette number 5, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape.